Welcome back to Mr. Nightgrim. Today we are bringing you 10 most disturbing true cemetery horror stories from beyond the veil. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're listening from, and if you've ever experienced something similar to what you're about to hear. We'd love to hear your stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Now let's go into the darkness together. The storm had torn through St. Mary's churchyard, like the wrath of something ancient and unforgiving. Samuel Granger stood at the iron gates as dawn broke over Whitstable, surveying the damage with the practiced eye of a man who had tended these grounds for 37 years. Fallen branches lay scattered across the gravel paths like broken bones, and the great oak that had shaded the Pemberton family plot since Victoria's reign now lay split and dying, its massive trunk blocking the northern boundary where the oldest stones tilted at odd angles, as if the earth itself had shrugged in its sleep. The other groundskeepers had gone home hours ago, muttering about insurance claims and overtime pay, but Samuel remained, his weathered hands gripping the handle of his wheelbarrow with the same determination that had seen him through 3 decades of burials, 2 heart attacks, and the slow decline of a churchyard that fewer and fewer souls visited with each passing year. The northern section troubled him most, not just the storm damage, but something deeper, something that made the hairs on his neck prickle whenever he worked alone among those ancient plots. The vicar, Father Morrison, had warned him against staying past midnight. "Some boundaries shouldn't be crossed, Samuel," the old priest had said, his voice carrying the weight of knowledge he'd never shared. "The north section has always been difficult. The records are incomplete there, you know. Burials from the plague years when proper rites weren't always observed." But Samuel had responsibilities. The diocesan council would inspect the grounds next week, and he'd be damned if they'd find St. Mary's wanting on his watch. He loaded his chainsaw and tools into the barrow, the metal rattling against itself like chattering teeth, and set off down the main path toward the damage. The cemetery stretched before him in the peculiar half-light of a January evening, its Victorian monuments casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward him with marble fingers. The newer sections near the chapel were orderly, well-maintained, with fresh flowers and polished granite headstones bearing names he recognized from the village. But as he wheeled deeper into the grounds, the stones grew older, more weathered, their inscriptions eaten away by centuries of English rain, until only fragments remained. "Beloved wife of, and, in the year of our Lord 18, and, may God have mercy." The Callaway Mausoleum dominated the northern corner like a fortress of black granite, its Doric columns supporting a roof green with lichen and age. Samuel had always avoided looking directly at it during his rounds. Something about its proportions unsettled him, the way its iron gates seemed to watch whatever approached. The structure dated to 1847, according to his records, built for some merchant family that had died out before the turn of the century. The gates had been sealed with a chain and padlock for as long as anyone could remember, the lock itself crusted with rust so thick it looked more like a growth than a fastening. He began his work methodically, sawing through the smaller branches first, their green wood bleeding sap that smelled sharp and alive in the cold air. The repetitive roar of the chainsaw filled the cemetery, drowning out the usual sounds, the distant hum of traffic from the Canterbury Road, the whisper of wind through yew trees, the soft settling sounds that old earth makes when disturbed by rain. It was past 11 when he noticed the quiet. The chainsaw had run out of fuel, and in the sudden silence that followed its death, Samuel became aware that something had changed. The wind had died completely, leaving the air still and heavy with the scent of wet earth and decay. Even the usual night sounds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant hoot of owls from the woods beyond the cemetery wall, had ceased entirely. He refueled the saw with hands that trembled slightly, though he told himself it was just the cold. The mercury on his pocket thermometer had dropped to near freezing, and his breath came in small puffs that dissipated quickly in the motionless air. As he worked, he found his gaze drawn repeatedly to the Callaway Mausoleum, its dark mass looming against the lighter sky like a hole in the world. The voices began just after midnight. At first, Samuel thought it was the wind returning, carrying sounds from the village, perhaps late revelers leaving the pub or the night train carrying freight toward Dover. But as he paused to listen, the sounds resolved into something more disturbing: human voices, multiple voices, chanting in a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of his own heart. The sound was coming from inside the Callaway Mausoleum. Samuel set down his chainsaw and approached the structure with the careful steps of a man who had learned to trust his instincts about places where the living didn't belong. The chanting grew clearer as he drew near, Not English, but something older, with syllables that seemed to catch in the throat like thorns. The words rose and fell in a pattern that suggested ritual, ceremony, supplication to powers that predated the Christian stones surrounding them. He circled the mausoleum once, his boots crunching on the gravel path that ringed the structure. The chanting continued, unbroken, emanating from within the sealed tomb with a clarity that suggested the speakers were not far from the iron gates. But when he peered through the bars, he saw only darkness, a darkness so complete it seemed to drink in the light from his torch. It was then that he noticed the gates were open. The chain lay coiled on the ground like a dead snake. Its padlock sprung open, though the metal showed no signs of tampering. The gates themselves stood slightly ajar, just wide enough for a man to slip through sideways. Samuel played his torchlight over the lock, examining it with the methodical attention of someone who had spent decades maintaining cemetery security. The mechanism was old but functional, well-oiled despite its external rust. Someone with the proper key could have opened it easily, but who in Whitstable possessed such a key? The chanting stopped. In the sudden silence, Samuel heard his own breathing, harsh and rapid in the cold air. He should leave. He should gather his tools, secure the worksite, and return in the morning with Father Morrison and perhaps the police. But something held him there, rooted to the gravel path, like one of the ancient yews that had watched over the dead for centuries. A voice spoke from within the mausoleum, clear and distinct in the night air. Samuel Granger. His name spoken by someone who had no business knowing it, someone who had no business being inside a tomb that had been sealed for over a century. The voice was male, educated, with the precise diction of a man accustomed to being obeyed. It carried an accent Samuel couldn't place, not quite English but familiar somehow, like a half-remembered song. "Samuel Granger," the voice repeated. "We have been waiting." Against every instinct screaming at him to flee, Samuel found himself stepping closer to the iron gates. "Who's there? This is private property, church property." Laughter drifted from the darkness, not one voice but several, a chorus of amusement that raised the hair on Samuel's arms. When the first voice spoke again, it carried a note of ancient authority that seemed to bypass his conscious mind and speak directly to something deeper. "We know where we are, keeper of the grounds. We have rested here far longer than your church has claimed dominion over these acres, far longer than your Christ has walked among the living." Samuel's torch beam penetrated perhaps 6 feet into the mausoleum before being swallowed by shadow that seemed too thick, too intentional to be natural darkness. He could make out the edge of a stone sarcophagus, carved with symbols that predated the Christian crosses adorning the newer graves. Beyond that, nothing but the pressing weight of unseen presences. "What do you want?" The words came out as barely more than a whisper. "We want what we have always wanted, Samuel Granger. We want to be remembered. We want our names spoken by the living. We want our offerings received and our counsel heard." The voice paused, and in that pause Samuel heard the soft shuffle of movement within the tomb. "But the world has forgotten us. The old ways have been buried beneath your stone angels and Latin prayers. We fade, keeper of the grounds. We diminish." "I don't understand." "You will." Another voice joined the first, this one female with the cultured tones of aristocracy. "You tend these grounds with care, Samuel Granger. You know the names on every stone, the dates of every burial. You understand the weight of memory, the burden of caring for those who cannot care for themselves." A third voice, older, rougher. "The living world rushes past our gates without pause. Your village remembers us only as quaint historical curiosities. But you, keeper, you walk among us daily. You know we are more than stone and bone." Samuel found himself drawn forward another step, his torch beam wavering as his hand trembled. The rational part of his mind catalogued the impossibility of what was happening, voices from a sealed tomb, knowledge of his name and habits, the overwhelming sense of being in the presence of intelligences that had persisted far beyond the death of their bodies. But a deeper part, the part that had always felt the weight of the cemetery's watchful silence, recognized something true in their words. "What would you have me do?" The first voice spoke again, and now Samuel could hear satisfaction in its tone. "Serve as our link to the living world, Samuel Granger. Visit us each night when the church bells toll midnight. Bring us news of the village, of the families whose descendants rest in your care. Speak our names aloud so that we might not be forgotten entirely." "And if I refuse?" Silence stretched between them, heavy with implication. When the female voice spoke again, it carried a note of gentle warning. This cemetery has had many keepers, Samuel Granger. Some understood their true duties. Others required instruction. Images flashed through Samuel's mind. His predecessor, old Thomas Webb, found dead among the northern plots on a morning much like this one. His face locked in an expression of such terror that the coroner had refused to let his family view the body. The keeper before Thomas, who had simply vanished one winter night, leaving only his lantern burning beside an open grave. The stories whispered in the village pub about groundskeepers who aged too quickly, who developed strange habits, who spoke to empty graves as if expecting answers. "You're asking me too. We ask nothing that you do not already do," the male voice interrupted. "You care for this ground. You tend our monuments. You respect the dead. We simply ask that you extend that care. Include us in your rounds. Acknowledge our presence. Act as our voice when the living world has need of our wisdom." Samuel felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a burial shroud. In the distance, the church clock began to chime midnight, its bronze voice carrying across the sleeping village with measured authority. 12 strokes, marking the boundary between one day and the next, between the world of the living and whatever realm claimed the hours of deepest night. "If I agree," he said slowly, "what assurance do I have that no harm will come to me, to the village? We are not malevolent, keeper of the grounds. We are forgotten. There is a difference." The female voice carried a note of ancient sadness. "We seek only to maintain our connection to the world we once knew, to offer guidance to those wise enough to seek it, to ensure that our names are not lost entirely to the march of time." The clock finished its midnight toll, and in the silence that followed, Samuel made his choice. Perhaps it was the weight of 37 years spent walking among the dead, or the accumulated loneliness of a job that few understood and fewer appreciated. Perhaps it was the recognition that these voices spoke to something he had always sensed but never acknowledged, that death was not an ending but a transformation, that the cemetery was not a warehouse for the discarded past, but a repository of continuing existence. "I accept," he said. The iron gate swung fully open with a sound like distant thunder, revealing the interior of the mausoleum in all its ancient glory. Stone sarcophagi lined the walls, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the torchlight. The air that flowed out carried scents of earth and time, and something indefinably vital, as if the space within existed according to different natural laws than the world outside. "Welcome, Samuel Granger," the voices said in unison. "Welcome to your true duties." From that night forward, Samuel's routine changed. He continued his daily work with the same meticulous care, but when the church clock struck midnight, he found himself drawn to the northern section of the cemetery. The Callaway Mausoleum's gates remained unlocked, though they appeared sealed to any observer who happened to pass during daylight hours. Inside, he would sit on a stone bench that seemed to exist only in darkness and listen to voices that spoke of village history stretching back centuries, of family secrets buried with the dead, of knowledge that transcended the boundary between life and death. They told him of coming storms, of troubles brewing in families whose ancestors rested in his care, of opportunities that the living might seize if properly warned. In return, he brought them news of the outside world, births and deaths, marriages and divorces, the small dramas that comprise village life. He spoke the names carved on weathered headstones, reciting the stories attached to each burial, ensuring that the dead were remembered not merely as dates and epitaphs, but as complete human beings who had loved and feared and hoped. The other groundskeepers noticed changes in him. He seemed to age more slowly, to possess knowledge of the cemetery's history that extended far beyond official records. He could predict when graves would need attention, when storms would damage particular sections, when certain families would come to visit their dead. His care of the grounds became something approaching artistry, each path and flower bed maintained with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. Father Morrison watched these changes with growing unease, but when he questioned Samuel about his new habits, the groundskeeper simply smiled and spoke of dedication to duty, of the sacred trust involved in caring for the dead. The priest had no evidence of wrongdoing, no concrete reason to interfere with a man who performed his job with unprecedented skill and devotion. The village, meanwhile, began to notice subtle improvements in their fortunes. Warnings of impending problems seemed to arrive just in time. A phone call advising someone to check their elderly parent, a casual suggestion to avoid a particular road on a day when ice would cause accidents, investment advice that invariably proved sound. Those who listened to Samuel's occasional hints found their lives improved in small but significant ways. As months passed into years, Samuel came to understand that he had become something more than a groundskeeper. He was a conduit, a bridge between the wisdom of the dead and the needs of the living. The voices in the mausoleum were not malevolent spirits, but something far older and more complex. Guardians of memory, keepers of continuity, entities that had transcended individual death to become part of the eternal community of those who watched over the living from beyond the veil. And every midnight, when the church clock tolled the sacred hour, Samuel Granger made his way to the northern section of St. Mary's churchyard, where the Callaway Mausoleum waited, with its gates standing open and its ancient voices ready to share the accumulated wisdom of centuries. He had found his true calling at last, not merely as a keeper of graves, but as a guardian of the boundary between worlds, ensuring that death was not an ending but a transformation into something larger and more enduring than individual existence. The burden he carried was heavy, but it was also holy. The weight of memory itself, the responsibility of ensuring that those who had passed were not forgotten entirely, that their voices might still guide and protect the living world they had loved enough to watch over through all the long years of their eternal rest. The February wind cut through Montreal like a blade forged from Arctic ice, carrying with it the promise of another brutal night in a winter that seemed determined to break all records for cruelty. Elena Harper pulled her wool cap lower over her ears as she approached the wrought iron gates of Evergreen Cemetery, her camera bag slung across her shoulder like a familiar burden. Valentine's Day evening, most couples would be sharing intimate dinners in warm restaurants, exchanging gifts and promises. But Elena had always found romance in stranger places than candlelit tables and champagne toasts. The cemetery stretched before her in the fading light, its rolling hills blanketed in snow so pristine, it seemed almost blasphemous to disturb it with footsteps. Evergreen had been established in 1885 as Montreal's answer to the rural cemetery movement, its designers envisioning a place where the dead could rest in park-like beauty, while the living found solace in manicured landscapes and architectural monuments that rivaled European cathedrals. Now, over a century later, it served as Elena's personal gallery, a vast outdoor museum where light and shadow played across marble and granite in ways that never failed to capture her photographer's eye. She had discovered the cemetery 3 years ago while working on a series about urban spaces reclaimed by nature. What began as a simple documentation project had evolved into something approaching obsession. Every season brought new opportunities. Spring flowers emerging from snow-softened earth, summer afternoons when dappled sunlight filtered through ancient maples, autumn mornings when mist rose from the ground, like the breath of the sleeping dead. But winter was her favorite season here, when snow simplified the complex geometries of monuments and pathways into pure studies of form and texture. The caretaker's shed stood just inside the main gate, its windows glowing with warm yellow light. Elena could see old Marcel Dubois inside, updating his logbooks by the light of a kerosene lamp, a man so devoted to tradition that he refused to use electric lighting in his workspace, claiming it disturbed the cemetery's natural rhythms. He looked up as her boots crunched past on the packed snow, raising one weathered hand in greeting. Marcel had grown accustomed to her evening visits, though he still shook his head at her insistence on working after dark. "Bonsoir, Mademoiselle Elena," he called through the window. "Cold night for pictures, non?" "The best kind," she replied, her breath forming clouds in the crystalline air. "Light's perfect just after sunset." Marcel's expression grew serious, his deeply lined face creasing with concern. "You be careful in the old section tonight, eh? Storm yesterday." She moved things around, paths not so clear. Elena nodded her thanks and continued deeper into the cemetery, following the main avenue past monuments that stood like silent sentinels in the gathering dusk. The newer sections near the entrance featured uniform granite headstones arranged in neat rows, their inscriptions crisp and modern. But as she walked, the markers grew older, more elaborate. Victorian angels with weather-worn faces, obelisks that pierced the sky like fingers reaching toward heaven, mausoleums built to house entire family dynasties, and marble halls that echoed with the footsteps of the living. Her destination lay in the cemetery's heart, where the original burials from the 1880s created a landscape of extraordinary architectural diversity. Here, wealthy Montreal families had competed to create the most impressive monuments to their dead, resulting in a collection of tombs that ranged from Egyptian Revival pyramids to Gothic Revival chapels, complete with flying buttresses and rose windows. The storm Marcel had mentioned had indeed changed things. Snow had drifted against the monuments in new patterns, creating sculptural forms that begged to be captured in silver and shadow. Elena unpacked her equipment with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent countless hours working in challenging conditions. Her Canon 5D Mark IV emerged from its protective case, followed by her favorite lens, a 24-70mm Felix 2.8 that could handle the low-light conditions she preferred. She mounted the camera on a carbon fiber tripod, its legs sinking slightly into the snow until they found solid ground beneath. The first shots were purely technical, test exposures to gauge the available light, adjustments to white balance and ISO settings, experiments with different angles and compositions. But as she worked, Elena felt the familiar transformation that occurred whenever she lost herself in the creative process. The cold became irrelevant, the gathering darkness an ally rather than an obstacle. Through her viewfinder, the cemetery revealed secrets invisible to casual observation, the way moonlight created pools of silver between the monuments, how shadow and snow combined to suggest forms that existed only in the interplay of light and darkness. She was composing a shot of the Beaumont family mausoleum when she first noticed something unusual in her LCD display. The image showed the expected scene, the Gothic revival structure with its pointed arches and carved gargoyles, snow banking against its granite steps, bare tree branches creating a delicate tracery against the darkening sky. But in the background, just at the edge of the frame, there appeared to be a pale vertical shape that didn't correspond to anything she could see with her naked eye. Elena lowered the camera and studied the scene directly. The area in question showed only empty snow and the dark bulk of a distant monument. She raised the camera again and took another shot from the same position. The pale shape appeared again, clearer this time, definitely human in form, standing motionless among the headstones, like a person caught in the act of visiting a grave. A chill that had nothing to do with the February air crept up Elena's spine. She had photographed cemeteries in dozens of cities, under every conceivable lighting condition, and had never encountered anything like this. Atmospheric effects could create strange illusions. Mist, precipitation, even camera malfunctions could produce anomalous images. But this had the distinct characteristics of a human figure, complete with what appeared to be period clothing, a long coat or dress that belonged to an earlier era. She moved to a different position and took another series of shots, this time focusing deliberately on the area where the figure had appeared. Each image revealed the shape more clearly, and now she could see details that made her hands tremble as she adjusted her camera settings. The figure was that of a woman in Victorian mourning dress, complete with a black veil that obscured her features. She stood with the posture of someone deep in grief, her head bowed toward a weathered headstone that Elena could now identify as belonging to one Marie-Claire Rousseau, who had died in 1894 at the age of 23. Elena forced herself to breathe slowly, to approach this phenomenon with the methodical mindset that had made her a respected photographer. There had to be a rational explanation, some combination of lighting conditions, camera settings, and environmental factors that was creating this illusion. She changed lenses, adjusted her position, modified her exposure settings, but with each new shot, the figure became more distinct, more undeniably present in her images, while remaining completely invisible to her direct observation. As she worked, other shapes began to appear in her photographs. At first they were indistinct pale smudges against the snow that might have been dismissed as lens flares or digital artifacts. But as Elena continued shooting, moving systematically through the older sections of the cemetery, the shapes resolved into an increasingly disturbing clarity. Men in formal Victorian dress stood beside elaborate monuments, their faces turned toward her camera with expressions of sorrowful attention. Women in mourning attire knelt beside children's graves, their veils unable to conceal the profound grief etched in their postures. Children themselves wandered between the headstones, their period clothing marking them as belonging to an age when childhood mortality was a common tragedy. Elena's breath came in sharp puffs as she realized the scope of what her camera was revealing. The cemetery was populated, not by the living, but by presences that existed in some spectrum invisible to human eyes, but accessible to her digital sensor. Each photograph showed more figures than the last, a growing congregation of the dead that seemed drawn to her presence like moths to flame. She paused in her work, her hands shaking too violently to hold the camera steady. The rational part of her mind cataloged possible explanations: equipment malfunction, some form of digital interference, even the possibility that she was experiencing a psychological episode brought on by stress and isolation. But the photographer in her recognized something more disturbing. These were not random artifacts or hallucinations. The figures in her images showed consistent characteristics, period clothing appropriate to their burial dates, postures that suggested awareness of her presence, positioning that indicated they were actually interacting with the physical space of the cemetery in ways that suggested genuine existence. A sound made her look up from her camera's LCD screen, the soft crunch of footsteps in snow, approaching from the direction of the cemetery's oldest section. Elena strained her eyes against the darkness, but saw nothing beyond the familiar landscape of monuments and trees. Yet the footsteps continued, measured and deliberate, as if someone was walking directly toward her position. She raised her camera and fired off a rapid series of shots in the direction of the sound. The images that appeared on her display made her cry out in shock. Not one figure but dozens, arranged in a rough semicircle around her position. They stood motionless in the snow, their faces turned toward her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something approaching hunger. Men, women, and children from across the centuries of the cemetery's existence, all sharing the pale, translucent quality that marked them as belonging to some realm beyond the living world. Elena lowered her camera with trembling hands, her professional composure finally cracking under the weight of what she was witnessing. She could hear them now, not just footsteps, but whispers, conversations carried on in languages that included French, English, and others she couldn't identify. The sounds seemed to come from all directions at once, as if the entire cemetery had awakened to acknowledge her presence. She began walking toward the main gate, her equipment forgotten in her haste to reach the familiar safety of the living world. But as she moved, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She could hear her name being called. Elena Harper, spoken by voices that carried accents from different eras, different social classes, different cultures united only by their shared residence in Evergreen Cemetery. Unable to resist the compulsion, she stopped and raised her camera one more time. The image that filled her viewfinder was unlike anything from her previous shots. The pale figures had drawn closer, forming concentric circles around her position with the precision of some ancient ritual. Their faces were clearer now, and Elena could see that they were not malevolent but profoundly sad, their expressions conveying a longing that transcended the boundary between life and death. At the center of the gathering stood the woman in Victorian mourning dress who had appeared in her first strange photograph. Now Elena could see her face beneath the veil, young, beautiful, marked by a grief so profound it seemed to radiate outward like heat from a forge. When she spoke, her voice carried across the snow-muffled cemetery with crystalline clarity. "We have been waiting so long for someone who could see us truly." Elena tried to speak, but found her voice trapped in her throat by a combination of terror and awe. The woman continued, her words carrying the precise diction of educated Victorian society. "Your device captures what the living eye cannot perceive. You have given us form again, substance in the world we once knew. We are grateful beyond measure." Other voices joined hers, creating a chorus that seemed to emanate from the snow itself. "Remember us. Speak our names. Tell them we are still here." Elena felt the weight of their collective longing settling on her shoulders like a burial shroud. These were not malevolent spirits, but something far more complex, souls who had remained connected to the physical world through bonds of love, grief, and unfinished business. They sought not to harm the living, but to be acknowledged, to have their continued existence recognized by those who still drew breath in the world they had lost. But understanding their nature did nothing to lessen Elena's terror. She was alone in a dark cemetery, surrounded by presences that existed beyond the natural order, being asked to serve as their representative to a world that had forgotten them. The rational part of her mind recognized the honor in such a request, but her primitive survival instincts screamed at her to flee before she became trapped in whatever bargain they were offering. She began walking again, faster now, her boots slipping on the packed snow as she made her way toward the main avenue. Behind her, the whispers rose to a crescendo, not angry but desperate, the sound of souls watching their one chance for recognition slip away. Elena could hear individual voices calling her name, begging her to stay, promising her knowledge and experiences beyond mortal understanding if she would only listen to their stories. The cemetery's main gate appeared ahead, its wrought iron bars outlined against the glow of street lamps beyond. Elena could see Marcel's shed, its windows still glowing with warm yellow light, and beyond that the familiar world of traffic and electric lights, and the blessed ordinariness of living human activity. She broke into a run, her camera bag bouncing against her hip as she covered the final 100 yards to safety. At the gate she turned back one last time, raising her camera for a final shot. The cemetery stretched behind her in the moonlight, its monuments casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. Through her viewfinder, she could see them all, hundreds of figures standing motionless among the headstones, their pale forms creating a vast congregation of the forgotten dead. They made no move to follow her, respecting some ancient boundary that separated their realm from the world of the living. But their eyes followed her movement, and in their collective gaze, Elena read a patience that transcended human understanding. The patience of those who had already waited over a century, and could wait centuries more for the right person to tell their stories. She lowered the camera and walked through the gate, not stopping until she reached her car parked on the street beyond. As she drove away from Evergreen Cemetery, Elena could see the pale figures still standing among the monuments in a rearview mirror, watching her departure with the same sorrowful dignity they had shown throughout the encounter. In the weeks that followed, Elena found herself unable to return to cemetery photography. Every time she raised her camera in such a setting, she could feel their presence waiting just beyond the range of human perception, ready to step into the light of her flash and make their existence known. The images from that Valentine's evening remained on her memory cards, a digital record of her encounter with forces that existed beyond the boundary of life and death. She never published those photographs, never spoke publicly about what she had witnessed in the snow-covered paths of Evergreen Cemetery. But sometimes, late at night when the wind howled around her apartment windows with the same voice she had heard among the monuments, Elena would review those images and remember the weight of collective longing in the voices that had called her name. And she would wonder if somewhere in the darkness, they were still waiting for someone brave enough to tell their stories, patient enough to listen to the whispers of the dead, and skilled enough to capture their truth in light and shadow for the world to see. The genealogy research that had consumed Jonathan Ellis for the better part of 3 years reached its culmination on a crisp October morning in Willow Grove Cemetery, where the New Hampshire frost had turned the grass silver and the maple leaves blazed like torches against an iron-gray sky. He stood before a weathered slate headstone, its carved inscription barely legible after more than 2 centuries of New England winters, yet still clear enough to confirm what his painstaking archival research had revealed. Thomas Ellis, 1743 to 1821, his great-great-great-grandfather, lay buried beneath this modest monument in ground that had been consecrated long before the neighboring town of Millbrook had grown beyond a handful of farmsteads. Jonathan's breath formed clouds in the cold air as he knelt to place a spray of autumn flowers at the grave's base, his laptop balanced precariously on a nearby monument, while he cross-referenced burial records with his meticulously compiled family tree. The genealogy addiction had begun innocently enough, a retirement project to fill the empty hours after 40 years as a Boston insurance adjuster. But what had started as casual curiosity about his family's origins had evolved into something approaching obsession as he uncovered layers of history that extended far deeper than mere names and dates. The Ellis family records, scattered across courthouse archives and church registers throughout New England, painted a picture of ordinary colonial settlers, farmers, shopkeepers, and craftsmen who had helped carve civilization from the Massachusetts and New Hampshire wilderness. Yet there were gaps in the documentation, curious omissions that suggested some family history had been deliberately obscured. Thomas Ellis in particular appeared in the records with unusual frequency for a man of modest means, his name associated with land transactions, legal proceedings, and church disciplinary actions that hinted at a reputation extending far beyond typical farming activities. Jonathan had spent months piecing together fragments of Thomas's story from scattered sources, court records describing accusations of ungodly practices, church minutes detailing his eventual excommunication for consorting with dark forces, and deed transfers showing his acquisition of properties that seemed beyond his documented income. The most disturbing discovery had come from the private papers of Reverend Ezekiel Stone, donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society by descendants who apparently hadn't read them carefully. Stone's journal contained detailed accounts of Thomas Ellis's alleged involvement in what the preacher termed the old religion, practices that predated Christian settlement and drew their power from sources that decent folk preferred not to acknowledge. Now kneeling beside Thomas's grave in the shadow of Willow Grove's ancient oaks, Jonathan felt the weight of accumulated knowledge pressing down on him like a physical burden. The genealogical research had revealed not just names and dates, but a pattern of inheritance that extended beyond property and bloodline. The Ellis men, and it was always the men he had noticed, seemed to carry some burden that passed from generation to generation, manifesting in lives marked by unusual prosperity, followed by mysterious decline, by knowledge that set them apart from their neighbors, and by deaths that often occurred under circumstances that raised more questions than answers. The sun was setting behind the cemetery's western wall when Jonathan finally felt ready to attempt what he had traveled here to accomplish. From his research bag, he withdrew items that had taken months to acquire through discreet inquiries and careful study of 18th century magical practices. A piece of slate from the foundation of Thomas's original farmhouse, salt harvested from the marshes where his ancestor had once conducted his mysterious activities, and herbs grown in soil that had never been blessed by Christian ritual. These components, according to Reverend Stone's horrified accounts, had formed the basis of Thomas's workings, attempts to bind his descendants to powers that existed beyond the pale of acceptable colonial society. Jonathan had convinced himself that he was conducting an academic exercise, a historical recreation, designed to understand his ancestors' mindset rather than to achieve any supernatural result. But as he arranged the components and patterns copied from marginalia and Thomas's surviving papers, he felt the familiar weight of family legacy settling around him like a cloak. The Ellis men had always been drawn to hidden knowledge, always felt the pull of forces that promised power at prices that only became apparent after the bargain was struck. The ritual itself was surprisingly simple, a series of words in a mixture of Latin and something older, accompanied by actions that felt more familiar than they should have. Jonathan found himself speaking syllables that seemed to arise from some deep memory, moving through gestures that his hands performed with surprising confidence. As he worked, the cemetery around him grew unnaturally quiet, as if the usual sounds of wind and settling earth had been suspended to allow something more important to unfold. The first sign that his academic exercise had become something more came when the temperature dropped suddenly, causing his breath to form thick clouds despite the mild October weather. The second was the appearance of movement in his peripheral vision, shapes that vanished when he turned to look directly, but returned as soon as his attention moved elsewhere. The third was the voice that spoke his name from the direction of Thomas's grave, a voice that carried the accent and cadence of colonial New England, but possessed an authority that made Jonathan's bones vibrate with recognition. Jonathan Ellis. He looked up from his ritual materials to see a figure standing on the opposite side of the grave, tall, imposing, dressed in the plain dark clothing of an 18th century farmer, but carrying himself with the dignity of someone accustomed to command. The face was his own, Jonathan realized with a shock of recognition, but aged and weathered by decades of hard living, marked by knowledge that had come at a price that showed in every line and shadow. "Thomas," Jonathan said, surprised to find his voice steady despite the supernatural impossibility of the encounter. His ancestor smiled, an expression that held equal measures of approval and regret. "You have done well to find me, descendant. The family gift has not died out, I see, despite the passing of generations and the forgetting of old ways." Jonathan struggled to his feet, his knees stiff from kneeling on the cold ground. "I came here to understand. The records suggest you made some kind of pact, bound our family to something. I thought if I could comprehend what you did." Comprehension is the first step toward wisdom, Jonathan Ellis. But wisdom without action is merely intellectual exercise. Thomas moved around the grave with fluid grace, his feet making no sound on the frost-covered grass. "You seek to understand the burden I placed upon our bloodline. Very well, I will show you." The cemetery around them began to change, not physically, but in some fundamental way that altered the quality of light and shadow. The monuments remained in their familiar positions, but now they seemed charged with significance, each one marking not just a burial but a nexus of power that connected the realm of the dead to the world of the living. Jonathan could see lines of force stretching between the graves like luminous threads, creating a web of connection that encompassed the entire cemetery and extended beyond its boundaries into the New Hampshire landscape. "This is how I learned to see," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the transformed space with perfect clarity. "Not with the eyes of the flesh, but with the perception that comes when one accepts that death is not an ending, but a transformation. The power I sought, the power that cost me my place in Christian society, came from understanding that the dead do not depart, but merely change their form of existence." Jonathan felt his worldview reshaping itself around this new perception. The genealogical research that had consumed him suddenly revealed itself as something more than academic curiosity. It was a form of communion with ancestors who remained present and active, influencing the world of the living through bonds that transcended physical death. "But what was the pact?" he asked. "What did you bind us to?" Thomas's expression grew somber, the weight of centuries pressing down on his translucent features. I sought power to protect our family, to ensure that the Ellis bloodline would prosper in the New World, despite the challenges that awaited colonial settlers. The entities I contacted promised such protection, but their gifts come with obligations that pass from generation to generation. Images flashed through Jonathan's mind, not memories but inherited knowledge that had lain dormant in his blood until this moment of awakening. He saw Thomas conducting rituals in moonlit forests, drawing down powers that predated human civilization, forging agreements with intelligences that existed beyond the pale of mortal understanding. He saw subsequent generations of Ellis men wrestling with the legacy of those pacts, some embracing their inherited abilities while others tried desperately to escape obligations that followed them wherever they went. Each Ellis man must choose, Thomas continued. Accept the gifts and their accompanying responsibilities, or attempt to break the bonds that I forged in ignorance of their true cost. Those who accept find themselves able to perceive the hidden currents that shape human events, to influence outcomes through will and knowledge, to commune with ancestors who offer guidance from beyond the veil of death. But such gifts require service to powers that do not always share human values or concerns. Jonathan felt the weight of inherited obligations settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. The genealogical research that had brought him to the cemetery suddenly revealed itself as a form of unconscious preparation, his obsession with family history reflecting a deeper calling that had been building throughout his life. He understood now why he had never felt fully satisfied with ordinary existence, why he had always sensed possibilities hovering just beyond his perception, why he had been drawn to investigate mysteries that more practical people dismissed as irrelevant curiosities. "And if I refuse?" he asked. Thomas's smile held more sadness than humor. "The choice is yours, descendant. But understand that refusal does not eliminate the obligations. It merely ensures that they will pass to the next generation unprepared and unguided. Your children, should you have them, will inherit what you leave behind, just as you inherited what I bound to our bloodline centuries ago." The implications of this revelation struck Jonathan like a physical blow. His daughter Sarah, a marine biologist working in California, had already begun showing signs of the family gift, an unusual sensitivity to environmental patterns, dreams that predicted natural disasters, an ability to communicate with marine life that her colleagues attributed to professional intuition. His son Michael, an architect in Portland, had designed buildings that seemed to channel natural forces in ways that created unusual psychological effects in their occupants. Both possessed the inherited potential that Thomas's pact had woven into the Ellis bloodline, and both remained completely unaware of the supernatural legacy they carried. "What would you have me do?" Jonathan asked. "Accept what cannot be changed," Thomas replied. "Embrace the gifts that are your birthright. Learn to work with the powers that have watched over our family for generations, and prepare the next generation to carry forward what you have inherited." Jonathan looked around the transformed cemetery, seeing it now not as a repository for the dead, but as a nexus of power, where the boundary between worlds grew thin enough to permit communication between the living and those who had passed beyond. He understood that his genealogical research had been leading him to this moment of choice, that every document discovered and every family connection traced had been building toward this confrontation with the supernatural legacy that defined his bloodline. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable rather than chosen. Jonathan had spent his entire adult life sensing that he was missing some crucial element, that his ordinary existence was merely a pale shadow of what he might accomplish if he could access his full potential. Standing in the presence of his ancestor and feeling the weight of centuries of inherited power, he recognized that acceptance was not just the logical choice, but the only choice that offered any hope of understanding and controlling forces that would continue to influence his family regardless of his personal preferences. "I accept," he said. The words seemed to resonate through the cemetery with unusual force, causing the luminous threads connecting the graves to pulse with increased intensity. Thomas nodded with satisfaction, his form becoming more solid and defined as if Jonathan's acceptance had strengthened the bond between them. "Then let me teach you what you need to know," the ancestor said. "The first lesson is this: power without wisdom is mere destruction, but wisdom without power is mere philosophy. The entities that granted our family its gifts care nothing for human moral systems, but they respect strength and reward competence. Learn to think as they think, to see as they see, and you will find that the burdens of our pact become manageable." Over the hours that followed, though time seemed to flow according to different rules in the transformed cemetery, Thomas shared knowledge that had been accumulating in the Ellis bloodline for generations. Jonathan learned to perceive the hidden currents that influenced human events, to recognize the signs that indicated supernatural activity, to distinguish between beneficial and malevolent entities among the powers that watched the living world. Most importantly, he learned how to communicate with the ancestors who remained connected to the family despite their physical deaths, creating a network of guidance and support that extended across centuries. As dawn approached, Thomas began to fade, his form becoming translucent again as the forces that had made their communication possible weakened with the coming of daylight. "Remember," he said, his voice growing distant, "you are not alone in this burden. Every Ellis who has accepted the pact remains available to offer counsel and support. We are bound together across the generations by ties stronger than blood, united in service to powers that transcend individual existence." Jonathan found himself alone in the cemetery, as the sun rose over Willow Grove's ancient trees. But the solitude felt different now, charged with potential rather than empty of purpose. The genealogical research that had brought him here had revealed itself as preparation for a larger destiny, his investigation of family history, the first step in accepting a role that extended far beyond ordinary existence. In the months that followed, Jonathan discovered that his life had been fundamentally altered by his encounter with Thomas and his acceptance of the family legacy. He found himself able to perceive patterns in human events that remained hidden from others, to influence outcomes through focused will, to sense the presence of supernatural forces that most people dismissed as imagination. The genealogical research that had begun as a retirement hobby transformed into something approaching a sacred calling, as he worked to document not just family history, but the supernatural legacy that connected every generation of Ellis descendants. But perhaps most importantly, he began to understand that the pact Thomas had forged was not a burden to be endured but a gift to be embraced. The powers that watched over the Ellis family offered protection and guidance to those wise enough to accept their presence, and the obligations they required were not arbitrary commands but necessary services that maintained the balance between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Standing beside Thomas's grave on subsequent visits, Jonathan could feel the presence of his ancestor watching and approving as each generation of the family prepared to inherit the gifts and responsibilities that defined their bloodline. The cemetery had become more than a repository for the dead. It was a meeting place where past and present intersected, where the accumulated wisdom of centuries could be accessed by those brave enough to acknowledge their true heritage. And though the grave itself continued to emanate the strange presence that had first drawn Jonathan to investigate his family's hidden history, he no longer found that presence disturbing. Instead, it served as a reminder that death was not an ending but a transformation, that the bonds connecting the Ellis family transcended physical existence, and that the true purpose of genealogical research was not merely to document the past but to prepare for a future where the living and the dead worked together to preserve the delicate balance that kept both worlds in harmony. The mist rolled down from the cairngorms like the breath of ancient gods, thick and gray and heavy with the weight of Highland history. Malcolm Fraser stood beside his broken-down excavator in Glenmore Cemetery, watching the fog swallow the distant peaks while he contemplated the mechanical failure that had plagued his work for the past 3 weeks. The Caterpillar 320, reliable as Highland granite for 15 years of construction work throughout northern Scotland, had begun acting like a temperamental child the moment Malcolm had started preparing burial sites in the cemetery's forgotten Gaelic section. The cemetery itself occupied a broad terrace overlooking Loch Lenmore, its Victorian monuments and orderly paths giving way to older, rougher ground, where weathered stones bore inscriptions in languages that predated English influence in the Highlands. Malcolm had been contracted by the Highland Council to expand the cemetery's capacity, a straightforward job that should have taken 2 weeks to complete. Instead, he found himself wrestling with equipment failures that defied mechanical explanation and weather patterns that seemed to target his worksite with supernatural precision. The excavator's troubles had begun small: hydraulic fluid leaking from seals that had been recently replaced, computer systems rebooting randomly during delicate operations, tracks slipping on ground that appeared solid but behaved like saturated bog. Malcolm had attributed these problems to the usual challenges of working in Highland conditions, where machinery often struggled against an environment that seemed actively hostile to modern technology. But as the failures multiplied and grew more bizarre, he began to suspect that something beyond normal mechanical wear was affecting his equipment. 3 nights ago, the excavator's engine had died completely while Malcolm was working late to make up for lost time. The diagnostic computer showed no error codes. The fuel system appeared to be functioning normally, and every electrical connection tested perfectly. Yet the machine refused to start, its engine turning over without catching as if some vital component had been removed. Malcolm had spent hours checking every system, growing increasingly frustrated as each test revealed nothing wrong with machinery that simply would not operate. It was then, as midnight approached, and the Highland mist began to gather around the cemetery's perimeter, that Malcolm first heard the voices. They spoke in Gaelic, using words and phrases that stirred childhood memories of his grandmother's stories about the old days, when Highland clans had ruled their territories according to ancient laws that recognized powers older than Christianity. Malcolm's Gaelic was rusty, a consequence of decades spent working in English-speaking construction sites, but he understood enough to recognize that the voices were discussing him, debating something in tones that carried the authority of men accustomed to making decisions that affected entire communities. The fog thickened as the voices grew clearer, transforming the familiar cemetery landscape into something alien and timeless. Modern monuments disappeared behind walls of mist, while older stones seemed to gather substance and definition, as if the Highland fog was removing the overlay of recent centuries to reveal the burial ground as it had existed in earlier ages. Malcolm found himself standing not in a Victorian cemetery, but in an ancient clan graveyard, where weathered stones marked the resting places of warriors who had died defending territory that had been sacred long before the first church had been built on Highland soil. The figures that emerged from the mist carried themselves with a proud bearing of Highland chieftains, their forms solid enough to displace the fog but translucent enough to suggest existence beyond the physical realm. They wore the dress of different eras, some in ancient laine and brat that marked them as warriors from the earliest clan period, others in the more elaborate clothing of medieval Highland nobility, still others in the tartan and military gear of men who had followed Bonnie Prince Charlie into battle at Culloden. Despite their different periods of origin, they shared the unmistakable characteristics of Highland warriors: the erect posture of men who had never bowed to foreign authority, the alert eyes of scouts who had spent lifetimes watching for threats to their territory, and the weathered features of people who had lived and died by codes of honor that valued clan loyalty above personal survival. At their head stood a figure who commanded immediate respect, despite his ancient appearance. He wore the simple dress of a prehistoric Highland chieftain, leather and wool and bronze, with torques and arm rings that marked his status in a society that measured wealth in cattle and honor, rather than gold and land titles. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had led warriors into battle against Roman legions, who had defended Highland territory when the clans were still young, and the old gods still walked openly among the living. "You disturb our rest, Fraser of the Lowland machinery." Malcolm felt his knees weaken as he recognized the figure, not personally, but through the cultural memory that every Highland child absorbed with their grandmother's milk. This was one of the ancient ones, a chief from the time when the clans were still bound to the land by ties that transcended political alliance, when Highland warriors drew their strength from sources that modern people had forgotten but never entirely abandoned. "I meant no disrespect," Malcolm said, surprised to find himself responding in Gaelic, words returning from childhood lessons he thought he had forgotten. "I work to prepare graves for those who will follow. I serve the needs of the living." The ancient chief's expression softened slightly, recognizing Malcolm's use of the old language as a sign of respect for Highland tradition. "We know why you have come, Fraser. Your blood sings with Highland waters, your bones remember the mountains. You are not foreign to this place, but the machines you bring carry no memory of the old ways." Other figures moved closer, forming a rough semicircle around Malcolm's position. He could see now that they represented centuries of Highland dead, warriors who had fallen defending their clans from Viking raiders, knights who had died in the medieval conflicts that had shaped clan territories, Jacobite soldiers who had followed their chiefs into battles they could not win, but could not avoid. Despite their different eras of origin, they shared a common purpose that transcended individual identity: the protection of Highland territory from influences that threatened to destroy what their sacrifices had preserved. A younger figure stepped forward, wearing the uniform of a Highland regiment from the Great War era. His Gaelic carried the precision of formal education combined with the emotional weight of personal tragedy. "We are the guardians of this ground, Fraser. Every stone marks not just a grave but a point of connection between the living Highland and the realm of the ancestors. Your machines break those connections without understanding what they destroy." Malcolm began to comprehend the scope of his mistake. The cemetery expansion project, conceived by bureaucrats in Edinburgh as a simple matter of preparing additional burial space, was actually an intrusion into sacred territory that had been protected by clan spirits for countless generations. The mechanical failures that had plagued his work were not random breakdowns, but deliberate interventions by guardians who possessed the power to influence the physical world when Highland interests were threatened. "I had no knowledge of the sacred nature of this ground," Malcolm said. "If I have offended, I ask forgiveness and guidance. Tell me how to proceed without disturbing what should remain at peace." The ancient chief studied Malcolm with eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone to examine the Highland blood that flowed in his veins. Whatever he found there must have satisfied him, because his stern expression gradually gave way to something approaching approval. "You carry the memory of Highland honor, Fraser, even if you have forgotten its obligations. We do not ask you to abandon your work, but to conduct it with awareness of what you serve. This ground has been sacred since before the Romans came, blessed by the blood of warriors who died defending it, sanctified by the tears of clan mothers who buried their children here. Your machines must learn to respect what your ancestors died to preserve." "How can I teach respect to steel and hydraulics?" Malcolm asked. The chief smiled, an expression that transformed his ancient features with unexpected warmth. "The same way your ancestors taught respect to iron swords and wooden shields, through ritual acknowledgement of the powers that govern Highland territory. Each morning before you begin work, place offerings on the oldest stones. Speak the names of the clans that rest here. Ask permission from those who watch over this ground before you disturb earth that holds their bones." Another figure moved forward, a woman whose bearing marked her as a clan matriarch from the medieval period, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had raised generations of Highland children and buried more warriors than she cared to count. "The spirits of this place do not oppose your work, Fraser, but they demand recognition. We are forgotten by the modern world, dismissed as superstition by people who build roads through battlefields and housing estates on clan graveyards. But we remain, watching over Highland territory as we swore to do in life." Malcolm felt the weight of inherited obligations settling on his shoulders like a Highland plaid. His grandmother had told him stories of the old ways, of ritual observances that acknowledged the presence of clan spirits, of offerings left at sacred sites to ensure the protection of the ancestors. He had dismissed these tales as folklore, colorful stories from a primitive age that had no relevance to modern life. Now standing in the mist-shrouded cemetery surrounded by the spirits of Highland warriors, he understood that his grandmother's stories had been historical accounts rather than fairy tales. "What offerings would be appropriate?" he asked. The ancient chief's smile broadened, recognizing Malcolm's question as formal acceptance of Highland tradition. "Whiskey from Highland distilleries, oat cakes made according to old recipes, flowers that grow wild on Highland soil, simple gifts that acknowledge our continued presence and honor our service to clan and territory." The matriarch added her own guidance. "And remember that we are not distant gods to be feared, but ancestors who share your blood and your love for Highland ground. Speak to us as you would speak to your own grandmother. Tell us of your work and your concerns. Ask for our blessing on your efforts to serve those who will follow." As the night progressed, Malcolm learned that his role as a construction worker had been transformed into something approaching a sacred calling. The cemetery expansion project was not merely a matter of preparing burial sites, but an opportunity to strengthen the connections between the living Highland community and the ancestors who watched over them. His mechanical skills were still important, but they needed to be employed within a framework that acknowledged the spiritual dimensions of working with Highland soil. The spirits shared knowledge that extended far beyond construction techniques, understanding of Highland weather patterns that could help him avoid the worst seasonal storms, awareness of underground streams and bedrock formations that would affect excavation work, insight into the emotional needs of families who would use the new burial sites. Most importantly, they taught him to recognize the signs that indicated when his work was welcomed by the land itself and when it needed to be modified to avoid disturbing forces that modern people no longer understood, but which continued to influence Highland life. As dawn approached and the mist began to dissipate, the clan spirits gradually faded back into the realm of memory and legend. But their presence remained, woven into the Highland landscape like threads in a tartan plaid, ready to offer guidance and protection to those wise enough to acknowledge their continued existence. The ancient chief was the last to vanish, his parting words carrying across the cemetery with the authority of clan law. "Remember, Fraser, you work not just for the living, but for all who have called Highland territory home. Honor that trust, and we will ensure that your machinery serves you faithfully. Forget it, and you will find that Highland ground can be as hostile to intruders as Highland warriors once were to foreign armies." From that morning forward, Malcolm's work routine included elements that would have seemed bizarre to his construction colleagues, but which felt natural to someone whose blood carried Highland memories. Each day before starting his excavator, he placed offerings on the oldest gravestones: a dram of single malt whiskey, oatcakes baked by his wife, according to recipes inherited from her Highland grandmother, wildflowers gathered from the hills surrounding Loch Glenmore. He spoke to the clan spirits as if they were living supervisors, explaining his daily work plan and asking for their blessing on his efforts. The mechanical failures that had plagued his equipment disappeared entirely once he began following Highland tradition. The excavator operated with unusual smoothness, its hydraulic systems functioning perfectly even in challenging weather conditions, its computer systems maintaining stability despite the electromagnetic anomalies that Highland geology sometimes produced. More importantly, Malcolm found that his work proceeded with an efficiency that impressed the Highland Council officials who monitored his progress. But the most significant change was in Malcolm's relationship with Highland territory itself. The cemetery expansion project became an education in the deeper history of his homeland, as the clan spirits shared stories that extended far beyond written records. He learned about prehistoric sacred sites that lay beneath modern monuments, about clan battles that had shaped the emotional landscape of Highland territory, about traditions that had been preserved in spirit form long after they had disappeared from living memory. The burial sites he prepared seemed to resonate with particular appropriateness for the families who used them, as if the clan spirits guided his work to create resting places that honored both individual needs and collective Highland identity. Funeral directors commented on the unusual serenity of graveside services in Malcolm's section, and families often returned to leave additional flowers and offerings, drawn by something they couldn't articulate but clearly felt. On foggy Highland nights, when the mist rolled down from the cairngorms, Malcolm sometimes returned to the cemetery to sit among the stones and listen for voices that spoke in ancient Gaelic about the eternal responsibilities of Highland blood. The conversations had become a source of guidance and comfort, connecting him to a community that transcended the boundary between life and death, uniting him with generations of Highland people who had faced similar challenges and found similar solutions. The clan spirits had taught him that Highland territory was more than geography. It was a network of relationships that included not just the living, but all who had ever called the mountains and lochs their home. His work as a construction contractor had been transformed into service to that larger community, ensuring that modern Highland people remained connected to the ancestors who watched over them with the fierce loyalty that had defined clan culture for countless generations. And in accepting that responsibility, Malcolm had discovered that he was never truly alone on Highland ground, never without guidance when facing challenges that required both practical skill and cultural wisdom. The mist that rolled down from the cairngorms carried more than moisture and Highland air. It carried the voices of ancestors who remained ready to share their strength with descendants, brave enough to acknowledge their continued presence in the land they had died to defend. The morning mist hung low over Greenwood Cemetery like a shroud, transforming the familiar pathways of Chloe Martin's daily routine into something alien and unsettling. Her Siberian husky, Arlo, pressed close against her leg as they approached the cemetery's main entrance, his usual enthusiastic pulling replaced by a trembling that seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than mere cold. Chloe had been walking this route through Portland's oldest burial ground for 3 years, ever since she'd moved to the Laurelhurst neighborhood and discovered that the cemetery's winding paths provided the perfect setting for early morning exercise with her 4-year-old companion. Arlo had always been fearless, the kind of dog who would chase raccoons up trees, confront aggressive dogs twice his size, and investigate strange sounds that would send more cautious animals fleeing. His Siberian breeding had given him the thick coat and strong constitution needed for harsh conditions, while his individual personality combined intelligence with the stubborn independence that made huskies notorious for their strong wills. In 3 years of daily walks, Chloe had seen him face down everything from aggressive geese to territorial cats without showing the slightest sign of fear. But something about Greenwood Cemetery's older sections had always affected him differently. The cemetery's layout reflected Portland's growth over the past century and a half, with newer sections near the main entrance featuring orderly rows of modern headstones and well-maintained landscaping. These areas posed no problems for Arlo. He would trot along the paved pathways with his usual confidence, occasionally stopping to investigate interesting scents or watch the activities of the cemetery's resident squirrel population. But as they moved deeper into the grounds, towards sections where weathered marble monuments and elaborate Victorian tombs marked the resting places of Portland's founding families, his behavior would undergo a disturbing transformation. It began with subtle changes, a reluctance to maintain his usual pace, frequent stops to look over his shoulder, a tendency to press closer to Chloe's side, rather than exploring with his typical independence. The deeper they went into the historical sections, the more pronounced these behaviors became, until Arlo would be trembling visibly and whining softly, his ice-blue eyes scanning the cemetery landscape with the intensity of an animal sensing predators in unfamiliar territory. Chloe had initially attributed his nervousness to urban wildlife, perhaps coyotes that used the cemetery as a corridor between Portland's Forest Park and the residential neighborhoods, or aggressive cats that might have established territories among the monuments. But careful observation had revealed no evidence of threatening animals, and Arlo's reactions seemed focused on specific areas rather than general environmental concerns. Moreover, his fear appeared to intensify during certain weather conditions, particularly on mornings when fog rolled in from the Columbia River and transformed the cemetery into a landscape of shifting shadows and muffled sounds. This morning's mist was particularly thick, reducing visibility to perhaps 20 feet and creating an atmosphere that seemed charged with possibility. Chloe had considered skipping their usual walk, but Arlo needed exercise regardless of weather conditions, and she had always found something peaceful about the cemetery's fog-shrouded paths. The morning silence, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the occasional call of crows from the old-growth trees that bordered the grounds, provided a meditative quality that helped her prepare for days filled with the stress of managing a downtown graphic design studio. They entered through the main gates as usual, following the broad avenue that led toward the cemetery's heart. Arlo seemed normal at first, trotting beside her with his tail carried in its typical confident curve. But as they approached the junction where the main path branched toward the Victorian section, his demeanor began to change. His pace slowed, his tail dropped, and he began casting frequent glances toward areas where the fog grew thickest among the older monuments. Chloe had learned to read her dog's body language with the precision of someone who had spent years working with animals. The subtle signs that preceded his full-blown panic attacks in the cemetery's older sections had become as familiar as his expressions of joy and excitement. The trembling that started in his hindquarters and gradually spread throughout his body. The way his ears would flatten against his skull while his eyes remained fixed on something she couldn't see. The soft whines that seemed to carry notes of warning rather than simple fear. "What is it, boy?" she asked, crouching to run her hands through his thick coat. "What do you sense out there?" Arlo leaned into her touch but remained focused on the fog-shrouded monuments ahead, his body tense with the kind of alertness that wild animals displayed when confronting threats their human companions couldn't detect. Chloe had researched canine sensory capabilities enough to understand that dogs perceive the world through combinations of sight, sound, and smell that created a much richer environmental picture than human senses could provide. But Arlo's reactions in the cemetery seemed to go beyond normal sensory input. His behavior suggested awareness of something that existed outside the usual spectrum of natural phenomena. She made the decision that had become routine on mornings when his anxiety seemed particularly intense. They would stick to the newer sections where his discomfort was minimal, avoiding the older areas that triggered his most extreme reactions. But as they turned toward the more modern part of the cemetery, a sound stopped them both, a low whistle that seemed to come from the direction of the Victorian monuments, barely audible above the mist-muffled silence, but clear enough to suggest human origin. Arlo's reaction was immediate and dramatic. He pressed himself against Chloe's legs with enough force to nearly knock her off balance, his trembling increasing to the point where she could feel it through her jeans. The soft whines that had marked his earlier anxiety escalated into barely controlled whimpers, and his eyes remained fixed on the area where the whistle had originated with the intensity of an animal confronting a predator. Chloe stared into the fog, trying to make out shapes that might indicate another early morning visitor to the cemetery. The whistle had sounded like a human signal, perhaps someone calling a pet or a maintenance worker communicating with a colleague, but the mist made visual confirmation impossible, and no follow-up sounds suggested the presence of ordinary cemetery activity. "Hello?" she called, her voice seeming to be absorbed by the fog before it could carry any significant distance. "Is someone there?" No response came, but Arlo's agitation increased further. He began to back away from the Victorian section, pulling at his leash with unprecedented urgency. His behavior had moved beyond nervousness into outright panic, the kind of response she had seen from animals confronting immediate physical danger. Yet Chloe could detect nothing threatening in their environment. No aggressive animals, no unusual sounds beyond the initial whistle, no visual signs of human presence. Against her better judgment, she decided to investigate. Arlo's reactions had puzzled her for 3 years, and this seemed like an opportunity to discover what was triggering his extreme responses. If another person was in the cemetery, they might be able to provide information about conditions that could affect sensitive animals. If some kind of wildlife was responsible, she needed to know for future reference. "Come on, Arlo," she said, gently but firmly tugging his leash toward the Victorian section. "Let's see what's got you so worried." The effect on her dog was immediate and heartbreaking. Arlo planted his feet and refused to move forward, his powerful build making him surprisingly difficult to coax, despite Chloe's determination. His whimpers escalated into soft howls, not the joyful vocalizations that huskies were famous for, but sounds of genuine distress that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. When gentle coaxing failed to convince him, she tried picking him up, but 65 pounds of panicking husky proved too much for her to carry, while navigating the uneven cemetery paths. As they struggled, the atmosphere around them seemed to change in ways that Chloe couldn't quite define. The fog grew thicker despite the absence of any wind to move it, creating pockets of impenetrable mist that shifted and swirled without apparent cause. The temperature dropped noticeably, causing her breath to form clouds that hadn't been present when they entered the cemetery. Most unsettling, the morning silence deepened until even the distant traffic sounds seemed muffled beyond audibility. It was then that Chloe began to understand that Arlo's fear might be justified. The first whisper seemed to come from directly behind her, so close that she spun around, expecting to find someone standing within arm's reach. But the fog revealed nothing except the familiar shapes of monuments and trees, their forms wavering in the mist, like objects seen underwater. The second whisper came from her left, then her right, then seemed to surround them both with words she couldn't quite make out, but which carried emotional undertones that made her skin crawl. Arlo's panic reached a crescendo. He threw his entire weight against the leash, pulling with such force that the nylon strap cut into Chloe's palm. His howls took on a note of desperation that suggested he was trying to communicate something critically important, not just fear but warning, not just personal distress but concern for her safety. The whispers grew clearer, resolving into what sounded like conversations being conducted just beyond the range of clear audibility. Multiple voices speaking in tones that suggested urgency or distress, discussing matters that seemed to involve the cemetery itself and the people who visited it. Chloe caught fragments, references to the living ones, discussions of boundaries, warnings about crossing over, but the overall meaning remained frustratingly elusive. Arlo made his final desperate bid for escape, lunging backward with such force that he broke free from his collar entirely. Chloe watched in horror as her beloved companion bolted toward the cemetery's main entrance, running with the speed and desperation of an animal fleeing for its life. His powerful legs carried him between the monuments with surprising grace, his thick coat flowing behind him like silver silk, as he disappeared into the mist-shrouded pathways that led back to the safety of the living world. She found herself alone in the Victorian section of Greenwood Cemetery, surrounded by fog that seemed to press against her with almost physical weight. The whispers continued, growing more distinct as if Arlo's departure had removed some barrier that had kept them at a distance. Now she could make out individual words, phrases that suggested the speakers were discussing her presence with something approaching interest. "She can hear us. The animal knew. So few of the living listen." Chloe began walking quickly toward the main entrance, following the path Arlo had taken in his panicked flight. But the fog seemed to shift around her, creating corridors that led in unexpected directions and obscuring landmarks that should have guided her way. The cemetery's familiar layout became a maze of mist-shrouded monuments and paths that doubled back on themselves, trapping her in an environment that had been transformed from peaceful to threatening by forces she couldn't understand. The voices grew bolder as she struggled to find her way, speaking more clearly about subjects that made her blood run cold. They discussed the living visitors to the cemetery, cataloging their habits and vulnerabilities, debating which ones might be suitable for purposes they didn't fully explain. They spoke of animals as sentinels that could detect their presence, acknowledging that pets often served as early warning systems for people who might otherwise wander unprepared into situations beyond their understanding. It became clear that Arlo's fear had been protecting her from something that recognized no distinction between curiosity and invitation, that treated her presence in the cemetery as permission to make contact regardless of her intentions. The whispers suggested that the boundary between the living and the dead was more permeable than most people realized, that certain places and conditions could allow communication across that divide, and that such communication was not always welcome or beneficial to the living participants. Chloe ran then, following her dog's example and prioritizing escape over understanding. The fog seemed to part before her, as she abandoned any attempt to navigate by familiar landmarks, and instead followed her instincts toward what felt like safety. Behind her, the whispers rose to a crescendo of frustration and disappointment, as if her departure represented a missed opportunity for contact that might not come again soon. She burst through the cemetery's main gates to find Arlo waiting beside her car, still trembling but visibly relieved to see her emerge from the fog-shrouded interior. His ice-blue eyes met hers with an expression that seemed to convey both reproach and forgiveness. Reproach for forcing him into a situation his instincts had warned against. Forgiveness for her human inability to perceive dangers that were obvious to his more sensitive awareness. The drive home passed in silence, both of them processing an experience that had fundamentally altered their relationship with Greenwood Cemetery. Chloe understood now that Arlo's fear had never been irrational or inexplicable. He had been protecting them both from contact with forces that existed beyond normal human perception, entities that inhabited the older sections of the cemetery, and sought interaction with the living for purposes that might not align with human welfare. In the days that followed, their morning walks took different routes through Portland's extensive park system. Arlo seemed relieved by the change, returning to his normal confident demeanor as they explored trails that led through living forests rather than resting places for the dead. But sometimes, when fog rolled in from the Columbia River and transformed familiar neighborhoods into landscapes of mystery and shadow, Chloe would catch him staring in the direction of Greenwood Cemetery with the alert intensity of an animal monitoring a known threat. She had learned to trust his instincts completely, recognizing that animals possess sensory abilities that could detect phenomena beyond human perception. Arlo's fear had been a gift, an early warning system that had protected her from contact with entities that might have changed her life in ways she couldn't predict or control. The cemetery remained a beautiful and peaceful place for those who visited during bright daylight hours with purely memorial intentions. But for those who might be drawn deeper into its mysteries, especially during conditions that thinned the boundary between worlds, the warnings of a frightened husky had proven more valuable than any human advice could have been. The fog still came on certain mornings, transforming Portland's landscape into something otherworldly and full of hidden possibilities. But now Chloe knew that some mysteries were better left uninvestigated, that some boundaries were better left uncrossed, and that the instinctive fears of animals often reflected wisdom that humans had forgotten in their eagerness to rationalize experiences that defied logical explanation. Arlo had taught her that courage sometimes meant knowing when to run, and that the most important discoveries were often the dangers one learned to avoid, rather than the mysteries one insisted on solving. The autumn wind carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves through the narrow streets of Salem, Massachusetts, as Brandon Carter made his way toward Broad Street Burial Ground in the fading light of an October evening that seemed charged with the weight of local history. The dare had been issued by Marcus Chen and Jessica Valdez during lunch at Salem High, delivered with the casual cruelty that teenagers reserved for classmates they considered expendable. Brandon, the new kid from Ohio who had spent 3 months trying to navigate the complex social hierarchies of a town where family names carried 3 centuries of local significance, had been selected as the perfect candidate for a challenge that combined peer pressure with Salem's most enduring tourist attraction. "It's simple," Marcus had explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose ancestors had lived in Salem since before the witch trials made the town famous. "Just go to Magistrate Blackwell's grave at midnight, leave 3 coins like the tradition says, and take a selfie to prove you did it. Every Salem kid has done it. It's like a rite of passage." Brandon had wanted to refuse, not out of fear, but from the same instinct that had kept him away from similar challenges in his previous schools. But Salem was different from anywhere he had lived before, a place where local history wasn't abstract academic material, but a living presence that influenced everything from tourist commerce to social relationships. Refusing the dare would mark him permanently as an outsider, ensuring his senior year passed in the kind of isolation that made high school a daily ordeal, rather than a stepping stone to adult life. So he had accepted, though something in Jessica's expression had suggested the dare carried implications beyond simple teenage rebellion. Her great-grandmother, Elena Valdez, had been one of Salem's most respected local historians before her death the previous year. and Jessica had inherited both her knowledge of Salem's hidden stories and her tendency to speak about local history as if it were family gossip rather than academic material. "Just remember," Jessica had added, as Brandon walked away from their lunch table, "the coins are supposed to honor the magistrate's wisdom. That's why the tradition started. People leave offerings to show respect for his contributions to colonial justice." Now standing before the burial ground's iron gates, as the last light faded from the October sky, Brandon felt the weight of Salem's accumulated history pressing down on him like a physical burden. The cemetery itself was older than the witch trials, its weathered slate headstones marking the resting places of Puritan settlers who had carved their community from wilderness that the native Naumkeag people had considered sacred long before European ships appeared on the horizon. The stones bore inscriptions in archaic English, their carved skulls and wilted flowers serving as reminders that death had been a constant companion to people who built their lives on the edge of a continent that offered both opportunity and destruction in equal measure. Magistrate Blackwell's grave occupied a prominent position near the cemetery's center, its elaborate headstone marking the resting place of a man whose role in Salem's early judicial system had earned him the kind of historical recognition that local tour guides loved to embellish with stories of supernatural intervention and divine judgment. According to local tradition, visitors had been leaving coins on his grave for generations, seeking his guidance in matters of justice and moral judgment. The practice had become so established that even Salem's official tourist materials mentioned it as one of the town's authentic historical customs. Brandon had researched the tradition during study hall, using the school library's collection of local history materials to understand the context for what he was being asked to do. The sources painted Magistrate Blackwell as a figure of unusual wisdom and integrity, a colonial official who had earned respect from both his Puritan colleagues and the native tribes whose territorial disputes often required his mediation. His decisions had helped establish legal precedents that influenced Massachusetts jurisprudence for generations, and his reputation for fairness had made him a natural focus for folk traditions that sought connection with historical figures who embodied moral authority. But something in the historical accounts had troubled Brandon, subtle inconsistencies that suggested the official version of Blackwell's story might be incomplete. References to controversial decisions that weren't fully explained, mentions of accusations that were later proven false, and descriptions of his death as sudden and unexpected, despite no indication of illness or injury. Most puzzling, several sources suggested that the coin-leaving tradition had begun not during Blackwell's lifetime but years after his death, initiated by people who claimed to have received guidance from his spirit during moments of moral crisis. As midnight approached, Brandon made his way through the cemetery's winding paths, using his phone's flashlight to navigate between headstones that cast grotesque shadows in the artificial illumination. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, carrying sounds that seemed amplified by the darkness. The rustle of leaves, the distant hum of traffic from Boston Street, the occasional hoot of owls from the trees that bordered the burial ground. Salem at midnight felt different from Salem during daylight hours, as if the town's tourist-friendly version of its history gave way after dark to something older and more complex. Magistrate Blackwell's headstone loomed before him, its carved inscription barely legible after 3 centuries of New England weather. Brandon could make out fragments of the Latin epitaph, references to wisdom and justice that reflected the classical education that had marked colonial intellectual culture. At the base of the stone, previous visitors had left an assortment of coins, pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters that gleamed in his flashlight beam like offerings on an altar. He reached into his pocket and withdrew 3 quarters, chosen because they seemed substantial enough to satisfy the dare's requirements. But as he knelt to place them among the other coins, a voice spoke from the darkness behind him, clear and distinct in the midnight silence. "You honor the wrong man." Brandon spun around, his heart hammering as his flashlight beam swept across empty cemetery paths. The voice had been young, female, with the precise diction of someone educated in an earlier era. But no one was visible in the area around Blackwell's grave, and the cemetery appeared as deserted as when he had entered. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking slightly despite his efforts to sound confident. The response came from a different direction, as if the speaker had moved with impossible speed through the darkness. "You leave coins to honor a man who deserves no honor. You perpetuate a lie that has poisoned Salem's memory for 3 centuries." This time Brandon caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision, a pale figure standing among the headstones to his left, visible for just an instant before vanishing as he turned toward it. The figure appeared to be a young woman in colonial dress, her white gown and cap marking her as belonging to the Puritan era, but her posture suggesting youth and vitality rather than the solemnity usually associated with historical depictions of colonial women. "I don't understand," Brandon said, addressing the empty darkness around Blackwell's grave. The tradition is based on ignorance," the voice interrupted, now seeming to come from directly in front of him, though no figure was visible. Magistrate Blackwell was not the wise judge that Salem remembers. He was corrupt, cruel, quick to condemn the innocent while protecting those who shared his prejudices. The coins you would leave honor a man who sent innocent people to their deaths. Brandon felt the quarters growing cold in his palm as the implications of this revelation sank in. The dare that had seemed like simple teenage mischief was actually perpetuating a historical misunderstanding that had profound moral implications. But who was speaking to him, and how could he verify claims that contradicted centuries of established local tradition? The figure appeared again, this time close enough for Brandon to see her clearly in his flashlight beam. She was indeed young, perhaps 16 or 17, with the pale complexion and serious expression that marked Puritan portraiture. But her eyes held an intensity that suggested deep personal knowledge of the issues she was discussing, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed the events she described. "My name is Mercy Williams," she said, her form becoming more solid and defined as she spoke. "I died in 1692, condemned by Magistrate Blackwell on testimony he knew to be false. I was 14 years old, accused of witchcraft by neighbors who coveted my family's land. Blackwell accepted their lies because my father had opposed his political ambitions." The pieces of Salem's hidden history began falling into place in Brandon's mind. The witch trials of 1692 had been the town's defining historical moment, but the official accounts had always focused on the accusers and the accused, rather than the officials who had enabled the tragedy through corrupt or incompetent judgment. If Magistrate Blackwell had been one of those officials, if his reputation for wisdom and justice was actually a historical fabrication designed to protect his memory, then the coin-leaving tradition took on a much darker significance. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" Brandon asked. Mercy's expression grew sad, her translucent features reflecting centuries of frustration at being unable to correct the historical record. "Visit the true records, not the sanitized versions that Salem shows tourists. Look for the testimony that Blackwell suppressed, the evidence he refused to consider, the families he destroyed for personal gain. The truth has been preserved, but it requires effort to find." She gestured toward other areas of the cemetery, her movement drawing Brandon's attention to headstones he hadn't noticed before. Smaller, plainer markers that bore the names of people who had died during Salem's darkest year. "We are all here," she said, "the victims of Blackwell's corruption. We have watched for 3 centuries as people honor our killer, leaving offerings on his grave while our own resting places are forgotten." Brandon felt the weight of historical responsibility settling on his shoulders like a cloak. The dare that had brought him to the cemetery was not just about teenage social acceptance, but about his role in perpetuating or correcting historical injustice. The quarters in his palm suddenly felt like symbols of complicity, coins that would add his support to a tradition that honored wrongdoing while ignoring its victims. "What would you have me do?" he asked. Mercy's smile was the first expression of hope he had seen from her. "Place your offerings on our graves instead. Honor the victims rather than the perpetrator, and tell the living that the tradition they follow is based on lies that have been allowed to stand too long." She led him through the cemetery, pointing out headstones that marked the resting places of people who had died during or shortly after the witch trials, not just the famous victims whose names appeared in tourist materials, but ordinary Salem residents whose deaths had been connected to the hysteria and corruption that had plagued their community. Their graves were smaller, less elaborate, often difficult to find among the more prominent monuments that marked the resting places of Salem's established families. Brandon found himself learning Salem's true history from someone who had lived through its darkest period. Mercy shared details that never appeared in official accounts, stories of personal rivalries that had been disguised as religious persecution, evidence that had been suppressed to protect powerful families, testimonies that had been ignored because they came from people who lacked social standing. The picture that emerged was of a community that had allowed fear and greed to override justice, with officials like Magistrate Blackwell serving their own interests, while innocent people paid the ultimate price. As dawn approached, Brandon had placed his 3/4 on the graves of Mercy Williams and 2 other witch trial victims, their headstones now bearing coins that acknowledged their innocence and honored their memory. The act felt like a form of historical correction, a small step toward balancing scales that had been weighted against the truth for 3 centuries. Clarity came to him as the first light of dawn began to filter through the cemetery's ancient trees. The dare had been transformed from teenage mischief into something approaching historical activism. But more importantly, he had discovered that Salem's tourist-friendly version of its past concealed deeper truths that deserved acknowledgement and understanding. When Brandon returned to school the next day, he carried more than just photographic proof of completing the dare. He brought information that challenged the assumptions underlying Salem's most popular historical traditions, and he shared that information with classmates who had never considered that their town's past might be more complex than the sanitized versions they had grown up with. Jessica Valdez listened to his account with growing recognition, her great-grandmother's historical research having uncovered many of the same inconsistencies that Mercy Williams had explained. Together they began investigating Salem's hidden archives, discovering documents that supported the spirit's claims and revealed the extent to which local history had been shaped by the political needs of successive generations, rather than commitment to factual accuracy. The coin-leaving tradition didn't disappear overnight, but it began to change. Students who learned the true story started leaving offerings at the victims' graves instead of Blackwell's monument, creating a counter-tradition that honored historical truth rather than historical convenience. Some tourists, informed by guides who had been educated about the broader context of Salem's past, began to participate in this corrective practice. Brandon's senior year passed more successfully than he had hoped, his role in uncovering and sharing Salem's hidden history having earned him a form of respect that transcended simple social acceptance. But more importantly, he had learned that historical traditions were not immutable facts, but human constructions that could be examined, challenged, and changed when they failed to serve the cause of truth and justice. On subsequent midnight visits to Broad Street Burial Ground, now motivated by genuine historical interest rather than peer pressure, Brandon sometimes encountered Mercy Williams again, her translucent form visible among the headstones as she continued her centuries-long vigil over Salem's memory. Their conversations had evolved from revelation to collaboration, with Brandon serving as her representative among the living, while she provided access to historical knowledge that existed nowhere in written records. The cemetery had become more than a repository for the dead. It was a place where past and present intersected, where historical injustices could be acknowledged and addressed, where the voices of the forgotten could find new ways to speak to generations that had inherited the consequences of their silence. And in learning to listen to those voices, Brandon had discovered that the most important historical traditions were not the ones that preserved comfortable lies, but the ones that honored difficult truths, even when acknowledging those truths required courage that most people preferred to avoid. The Victorian splendor of Brompton Cemetery stretched before Henry Lawson like a city of the dead, its elaborate monuments and serpentine pathways illuminated by pools of sodium light that created islands of amber visibility in an ocean of London darkness. The cemetery's 39 acres contained over 35,000 burial sites, ranging from simple graves marked by weathered headstones to architectural marvels that rivaled the great cathedrals in their ambition and artistry. As head of the night security detail, Henry had walked these paths for 12 years, developing an intimate knowledge of every mausoleum, columbarium, and garden plot that comprised one of London's most magnificent burial grounds. Brompton had been established in 1840 as part of the Great Cemetery movement that transformed Victorian attitudes toward death and burial, its founders envisioning a necropolis that would serve as both final resting place and public park for London's growing population. The result was a landscape that combined the solemnity appropriate to a burial ground with the aesthetic beauty of a carefully designed garden, complete with tree-lined avenues, ornamental lakes, and architectural monuments that showcased the finest craftsmanship of the Victorian era. During daylight hours, Brompton attracted visitors who came to pay respects to famous residents, suffragettes, military heroes, artists, and inventors, whose graves had become pilgrimage sites for people interested in British history and culture. But Henry's domain was the cemetery after dark, when the gates were locked and the only human presence was supposed to be the security staff who monitored the grounds for vandalism, theft, and the occasional homeless person seeking shelter among the monuments. The night shift at Brompton required a particular temperament, comfort with solitude, respect for the dead, and the ability to find beauty in places that most people associated with grief and loss. Henry possessed all these qualities, along with an additional characteristic that had served him well during his years of cemetery security: the capacity to accept unusual experiences without allowing them to interfere with his professional responsibilities. It had begun during his second week on the job, when he first heard piano music drifting through the midnight silence from the direction of the cemetery's older sections. Henry had initially assumed that someone had left a radio playing, perhaps a maintenance worker who had forgotten to shut off his equipment. But investigation had revealed no electronic devices, no evidence of any unauthorized presence, and no logical source for music that seemed to emanate from the monuments themselves. The music was classical, pieces that suggested Victorian parlor entertainment rather than modern compositions. Chopin nocturnes, Schubert lieder, salon pieces by composers whose names appeared on some of Brompton's more elaborate headstones. The melodies drifted through the cemetery's pathways with crystalline clarity, as if being performed by accomplished musicians rather than reproduced by mechanical means. Henry had reported the incidents to his supervisor, who had recommended thorough patrols of the areas where the music was heard. But these patrols had revealed nothing beyond the usual cemetery features: monuments and trees, pathways and garden plots, the familiar landscape that Henry knew as well as his own neighborhood. The music continued, always just beyond the range of visual confirmation, always emanating from mausoleums that proved to be empty when investigated. After several months of fruitless investigation, Henry had reached an accommodation with the phenomenon. The music caused no damage, disturbed no graves, and seemed to occur during the quietest hours of the night, when his presence was the only human activity in the cemetery. Moreover, he had begun to find the nocturnal concerts oddly comforting, a soundtrack to his solitary patrols that transformed the potentially eerie experience of walking among the dead into something approaching aesthetic pleasure. But the music was only the beginning. As Henry's tenure at Brompton lengthened, he began to notice other anomalies that suggested the cemetery's nighttime hours were not as devoid of activity as daylight visitors might assume. Figures moved among the monuments, not intruders or vandals, but translucent forms that seemed to be conducting their own nocturnal business without reference to the living world. They walked dogs that left no footprints, read newspapers that cast no shadows, engaged in conversations that could be heard as whispers on the wind but never quite understood. Henry's first clear sighting had occurred during a foggy November night, when visibility was reduced to perhaps 10 feet in any direction. He had been patrolling the Circle of Lebanon, one of Brompton's most architecturally impressive areas, when he glimpsed a figure sitting on a bench beside the path. The figure appeared to be an elderly gentleman in Victorian dress, reading a newspaper by the light of a lamp that cast no glow on the surrounding fog. Henry had approached cautiously, expecting to encounter either a homeless person who had somehow evaded the perimeter security, or perhaps a maintenance worker taking an unauthorized break. But as he drew closer, the figure became increasingly translucent, until Henry could see the bench clearly through what had appeared to be a solid human form. The newspaper rustled in the figure's hands, pages turning with the crisp sound of real paper, but no warmth emanated from what should have been a living body. The gentleman looked up from his reading, acknowledging Henry's presence with a polite nod that suggested he considered the security guard's patrol a normal part of the cemetery's nighttime routine. His features were clearly visible despite his translucent state, a distinguished face with the carefully groomed whiskers that had marked Victorian respectability, eyes that held the alert intelligence of someone accustomed to staying informed about current events. "Good evening," the gentleman said, his voice carrying the educated accent of the Victorian upper classes. "Pleasant night for a walk, don't you think?" Henry found himself responding as if the encounter were entirely normal. "Yes, sir, though the fog's a bit thick for easy navigation." "Quite right," the gentleman agreed. "But one learns to find one's way, given sufficient familiarity with the terrain." He folded his newspaper with practiced precision and rose from the bench. "I believe I shall continue my constitutional. Give my regards to Mrs. Pemberton, when you encounter her near the columbarium. She's been asking about the new plantings in the children's section." With that, the figure walked away into the fog, his footsteps clearly audible on the gravel path despite his translucent appearance. Henry remained standing beside the empty bench, processing an encounter that challenged every assumption he had held about the nature of death and the boundary between the living and the deceased. Over the following months, Henry's patrols revealed an entire community of nocturnal residents who treated Brompton Cemetery as their continuing home rather than their final resting place. Mrs. Pemberton, a Victorian matron who tended spectral flower gardens with the dedication of someone for whom horticulture had been a lifelong passion. Colonel Ashworth, a military officer who conducted evening inspections of the cemetery's memorial sections while maintaining the bearing of someone still on active duty. Miss Thornfield, a governess who read to the spirits of children buried in the cemetery's smaller graves, her voice carrying through the night air with stories that seemed designed to comfort rather than entertain. Each spectral resident appeared to be continuing activities that had defined their living existence, creating a parallel community that operated according to Victorian social customs despite the passage of more than a century since their deaths. They acknowledged Henry's presence with the courtesy appropriate to someone whose work served their continued comfort, but they made no demands on his attention and seemed to require no assistance with their nocturnal activities. Henry found himself looking forward to these encounters, which transformed his solitary patrols into something resembling social calls. The spectral residents shared information about cemetery conditions that proved useful in his security work, areas where weather damage might require attention, sections where unauthorized visitors had left debris, locations where the cemetery's wildlife populations were establishing new territories. Their observations were more comprehensive than any human surveillance system could provide, offering insights into Brompton's ecological and social systems that extended far beyond normal security concerns. But perhaps most importantly, they provided Henry with a sense of community that made the isolation of night security work not just bearable but genuinely rewarding. The Victorian residents treated him as a valued member of their extended household, someone whose living status was simply another characteristic rather than a barrier to friendship and mutual respect. The most remarkable discovery came during Henry's 5th year at Brompton, when he realized that the spectral community extended beyond individual residents to include ongoing social activities that reflected Victorian leisure customs. Evening concerts in the cemetery's central court, where translucent musicians performed for audiences of appreciative spirits. Garden parties among the memorial roses, complete with spectral refreshments and conversation that focused on topics of continuing interest to people who had maintained their intellectual curiosity despite physical death. Literary societies that met among the monuments of famous authors, discussing books that had been published since their deaths with the enthusiasm of people for whom learning had been a lifelong pursuit. Chess clubs that gathered around marble tables that existed only in spectral reality, their games conducted according to rules that had been established during the height of Victorian club culture. Henry's role in these activities evolved from observer to occasional participant, as the spectral residents began to include him in their social planning and recreational pursuits. His living status provided valuable perspective on contemporary events, while his familiarity with cemetery operations made him a useful liaison between the spectral community and the physical maintenance requirements of their shared environment. The arrangement worked smoothly for years, with Henry serving as both security guard for the living world and unofficial community coordinator for Brompton's spectral residents. His reports to the cemetery administration focused on conventional security matters, perimeter integrity, equipment maintenance, weather-related damage, while his personal experience expanded to include social responsibilities that existed nowhere in his official job description. But the balance was disrupted during Henry's 8th year, when cemetery management installed new motion detection equipment designed to supplement human patrols with electronic surveillance. The system was state-of-the-art, capable of detecting movement that human observers might miss, and creating digital records of all nocturnal activity within the cemetery grounds. The first night the system was activated, it recorded dozens of motion events, far more than could be explained by normal wildlife activity or environmental factors like wind movement. The security company that monitored the electronic feeds reported possible intruders throughout the cemetery, triggering response protocols that brought additional security personnel and police units to investigate what appeared to be a massive breach of perimeter security. Henry found himself in the impossible position of trying to explain motion detection alerts that had no visible cause, while protecting the privacy of spectral residents who had no desire to become subjects of paranormal investigation. The additional security presence disrupted the nocturnal community's established routines, causing the spectral residents to avoid their usual activities, and creating an atmosphere of tension that affected everyone who worked or existed within the cemetery grounds. The crisis resolved itself through a solution that reflected both practical necessity and mutual respect. Henry worked with the spectral residents to establish patterns of movement that would minimize electronic detection while allowing them to continue their nocturnal activities. The motion detection system was recalibrated to ignore low-level movement that could be attributed to environmental factors, while Henry's patrol reports began to include careful observations that satisfied administrative requirements without compromising the spectral community's privacy. The new arrangement required more careful coordination and subtle communication, but it preserved the essential character of Henry's relationship with Brompton's nocturnal residents. The Victorian spirits continued their evening activities. The security systems provided the electronic monitoring that contemporary cemetery management required, and Henry maintained his role as bridge between two communities that shared the same physical space, but existed according to different natural laws. As his 12th year at Brompton drew to a close, Henry reflected on the education he had received in the complex nature of death and community. The cemetery that had initially seemed like a repository for the ended lives of London's past had revealed itself as a continuing neighborhood where death represented transformation rather than termination, where Victorian social customs persisted among residents who had adapted to spectral existence while maintaining their essential human characteristics. His night patrols had become more than security work. They were community service that bridged the boundary between the living and the dead, ensuring that both populations could coexist peacefully in a shared environment that served the needs of multiple forms of existence. The isolation that might have characterized solitary cemetery security had been replaced by social connections that enriched both his professional and personal life. Walking the darkened pathways of Brompton Cemetery, Henry often paused to listen for piano music, drifting from the Victorian mausoleums, to watch for spectral figures conducting their evening constitutional, to exchange greetings with residents who had welcomed him into a community that existed beyond the normal boundaries of human experience. The cemetery's magnificent monuments continued to honor the dead in ways their Victorian creators had intended, but they also sheltered a living community that had found ways to persist beyond physical death, while maintaining the social bonds and cultural activities that had defined their earthly existence. In learning to serve both communities with equal dedication, Henry had discovered that the most important aspect of cemetery security was not protecting the dead from the living, but ensuring that both populations could continue their respective activities in an atmosphere of mutual respect and shared appreciation for the remarkable beauty of London's most magnificent burial ground. The February thaw had come early to Quebec province, turning the snow-covered grounds of St. Augustine Memorial Park into a landscape of mud and slush that made grave preparation work both challenging and treacherous. Evelyn Marlowe stood beside the freshly dug plot where she had just conducted the burial service for Mrs. Beatrice Laurier, an elderly widow whose quiet death had marked the end of a family line that stretched back to Quebec's earliest French colonial settlements. The service had been small, attended only by distant relatives and a few elderly neighbors, reflecting the isolation that had characterized Mrs. Laurier's final years in a world that had gradually forgotten her existence. As the funeral director for Marlowe and Associates, Evelyn had overseen thousands of burials during her 23 years in the funeral industry, developing the professional composure and diplomatic skills necessary to guide families through their most difficult transitions. The work required a particular combination of empathy and emotional distance, deep enough compassion to understand genuine grief, sufficient detachment to function effectively during moments when others were overwhelmed by loss. Evelyn possessed both qualities, along with the organizational abilities needed to coordinate the complex logistics that transformed death from biological reality into socially manageable ritual. Mrs. Laurier's burial had proceeded according to established protocols, with the efficiency that characterized Evelyn's professional approach. The casket had been positioned correctly, the graveside service conducted with appropriate dignity, the interment completed according to both provincial regulations and Catholic traditions. Yet something about the entire process had felt unusual. Not wrong exactly, but charged with possibilities that extended beyond normal funeral procedures. The first sign that Mrs. Laurier's burial might have implications beyond ordinary interment came that evening when Evelyn returned to St. Augustine Memorial Park to check on the grave preparation work that had been scheduled for the following day. Cemetery maintenance was typically handled by the Memorial Park's own staff, but Evelyn had developed the habit of conducting personal inspections to ensure that her funeral arrangements met the standards she maintained for client service. St. Augustine had been established in 1923 as Quebec City's response to the rural cemetery movement, its designers creating a landscape that combined Catholic memorial traditions with the aesthetic principles that had transformed North American burial practices during the late 19th century. The result was a memorial park that served both as final resting place and as public garden, complete with tree-lined avenues, memorial chapels, and landscape features that encouraged contemplation rather than grief. The cemetery's layout reflected Quebec's complex cultural heritage, with sections devoted to different linguistic and religious communities, arranged according to patterns that honored both historical precedent and contemporary demographic realities. French Catholic families occupied the memorial park's central areas, their elaborate monuments reflecting traditions that stretched back to New France's colonial period. English Protestant sections featured more restrained memorial styles that emphasized individual achievement rather than family continuity. Recent immigrant communities had established their own areas, creating memorial landscapes that preserved cultural practices from their countries of origin, while adapting to Quebec's specific environmental and regulatory conditions. Mrs. Laurier's grave was located in the older French Catholic section, where weathered granite monuments bore inscriptions in Latin and French that reflected the educational traditions of Quebec's pre-Quiet Revolution culture. The plot itself was modest, a simple headstone that would mark her resting place without competing for attention with the more elaborate family tombs that dominated the section's central pathways. But as Evelyn approached the gravesite in the gathering dusk, she noticed something that hadn't been present during the afternoon burial service. A soft glow emanating from the area around Mrs. Laurier's fresh grave, barely visible in the fading daylight but distinct enough to suggest artificial illumination. Cemetery lighting was concentrated along the main avenues, leaving individual grave plots in relative darkness during evening hours. The glow around Mrs. Laurier's site was localized, gentle, and seemed to originate from the earth itself rather than from any external source. Evelyn's first assumption was that the cemetery maintenance staff had installed temporary lighting to facilitate evening work on adjacent plots. But investigation revealed no electrical equipment in the area, no work vehicles or tools that might explain the illumination. The glow appeared to be emanating directly from Mrs. Laurier's grave, creating a pool of soft light that extended perhaps 6 feet in all directions from the burial site. As she stood examining the phenomenon, Evelyn became aware of sounds that seemed inconsistent with normal cemetery acoustics. Whispers barely audible above the wind through the memorial park's mature trees, carrying words that suggested conversation rather than natural environmental noise. The whispers seemed to be coming from multiple sources, creating an overlay of voices that discussed subjects she couldn't quite make out, but which clearly related to the cemetery and its residents. The temperature around Mrs. Laurier's grave felt several degrees warmer than the surrounding area, despite the absence of any heating equipment. Evelyn could smell flowers, not the funeral arrangements that would have wilted in the February cold, but fresh spring blossoms that suggested seasonal conditions completely inconsistent with the Quebec winter that still gripped the memorial park. The sensory inconsistencies created an environment that felt somehow separated from normal physical reality, as if the burial site existed according to different natural laws than the rest of St. Augustine Memorial Park. Evelyn's professional training included preparation for unusual situations that might arise during funeral work, family conflicts, unexpected medical emergencies, logistical problems that required immediate problem solving. But nothing in her education or experience had prepared her for phenomena that suggested supernatural activity around burial sites. Her instinct was to investigate further, both to understand what was happening and to determine whether the situation required any form of professional response. The whispers grew clearer as she remained in the area, resolving into words that suggested the speakers were discussing her presence with something approaching interest. She could make out references to the funeral lady, discussions of proper burial customs, and what sounded like expressions of gratitude for services rendered. The tone was respectful rather than threatening, suggesting that whatever was responsible for the phenomena viewed her professional activities with approval rather than resentment. It was then that Evelyn noticed movement in her peripheral vision, a translucent figure standing among the headstones, perhaps 20 feet from Mrs. Laurier's grave. The figure appeared to be a young woman in early 20th century dress, her clothing and posture suggesting someone from Quebec's pre-World War II period. She stood quietly, watching Evelyn with an expression that combined curiosity with something that might have been longing. Evelyn approached the figure slowly, prepared to retreat if the encounter proved threatening or disturbing. But as she drew closer, the young woman's features became clearer, revealing a face marked by sadness so profound it seemed to transcend individual grief and touch on universal human experiences of loss and abandonment. "You can see me," the figure said, her voice carrying the distinctive accent of Quebec French, but speaking in English as if accommodating Evelyn's linguistic preferences. "So few of the living notice our presence." "Who are you?" Evelyn asked, surprised to find her voice steady despite the supernatural nature of the encounter. "My name is Colette Dubois," the young woman replied. "I died in 1943, buried here in a grave that has no marker, forgotten by family who moved away, and friends who lost touch during the war years. I have been waiting for someone who might acknowledge my existence." Evelyn felt the weight of professional responsibility settling on her shoulders like a burial shroud. As a funeral director, she had devoted her career to ensuring that the dead received appropriate recognition and memorial, that families could find closure through rituals that honored their lost loved ones. The idea that someone buried in her care area had been forgotten, left without proper memorial or continuing acknowledgement, troubled her deeply. "Where is your grave?" she asked. Colette gestured toward a section of the cemetery that appeared to be unused, an area where the ground showed no signs of burial activity and no headstones marked individual graves. "There," she said, "in ground that was designated for charity burials, people who died without family or resources to purchase proper memorial sites. We are buried there, but nothing marks our presence." Evelyn followed Colette's gesture, studying an area she had never paid attention to during her years of conducting services at St. Augustine Memorial Park. The section appeared to be rough ground, perhaps used for maintenance equipment storage or left undeveloped for future expansion. But as she looked more carefully, she could see subtle depressions in the earth that might indicate filled graves, patterns in the grass growth that suggested underground disturbances. "How many?" she asked. "Dozens," Colette replied. "People who died during the Depression, the war years, the difficult times when families couldn't afford proper burial customs. We were interred according to legal requirements, but no one remembered us afterward. No one speaks our names, no one visits our graves, no one acknowledges that we lived and loved and hoped like everyone else." The implications of this revelation struck Evelyn with professional and personal force. As someone whose career was built on ensuring appropriate memorial for the dead, she found the existence of forgotten graves in her service area both professionally disturbing and morally challenging. But more than that, she recognized that Colette's appearance might represent an opportunity to address historical oversights that had left an entire community of the dead without proper recognition. "What would you have me do?" Evelyn asked. Colette's expression brightened with the first sign of hope Evelyn had seen from her. "Remember us," she said. "Speak our names. Create some form of memorial that acknowledges our presence here. We don't require elaborate monuments, just recognition that we existed, that our lives had meaning even if we died without resources to purchase lasting memorial." Over the following weeks, Evelyn began researching the history of charity burials at St. Augustine Memorial Park. The cemetery records, stored in archives that hadn't been accessed for decades, revealed exactly what Colette had described: dozens of burials during the 1930s and 1940s of people who had died without family or financial resources to purchase traditional grave sites. They had been interred in a section designated for such purposes, their burials recorded according to provincial requirements, but without the markers or continuing care that characterized regular cemetery operations. The records included names, death dates, and brief biographical information that painted a picture of people who had lived on the margins of Quebec society during some of its most difficult years. Immigrant workers who had died far from their families, elderly people whose relatives had scattered to other provinces, young people whose deaths from disease or accident had left them without anyone to arrange proper memorial. Each record represented a complete human life, with its own story of hopes and struggles, relationships and achievements, reduced to administrative entries that had been filed and forgotten. Evelyn found herself drawn into these individual stories, researching what she could discover about lives that had been lived quietly and ended without fanfare. Colette Dubois, she learned, had been a young seamstress who had died of tuberculosis during the war, leaving behind friends but no family in Quebec. Her death had occurred during a period when medical resources were strained and funeral customs were simplified by wartime conditions, resulting in burial arrangements that met legal requirements without providing lasting memorial. But Colette was only one of many. The records revealed an entire community of forgotten dead whose stories deserved recognition and whose graves deserved acknowledgement. More importantly, Evelyn began to understand that the phenomena around Mrs. Laurier's grave had been a form of supernatural coordination, a way for the forgotten dead to draw her attention to their situation by demonstrating their continuing presence in the memorial park. The solution she developed reflected both professional expertise and personal commitment to ensuring appropriate memorial for all of the cemetery's residents. Working with Saint Ced, Augustine's administration, and several Quebec historical societies, Evelyn arranged for the creation of a memorial garden in the previously unmarked burial area. The garden featured a central monument that listed the names of everyone buried in the charity section, along with individual markers that provided basic biographical information and appropriate religious symbols. The memorial dedication ceremony attracted attention from local media and community organizations, many of whom were surprised to learn about the existence of unmarked graves in one of Quebec City's most established memorial parks. But the most significant response came from the spirits themselves, who gathered in translucent crowds around the new memorial, as if attending a long-delayed funeral service. Colette appeared again during the dedication ceremony, her form more solid and defined than during their first encounter. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying gratitude that seemed to speak for the entire community of forgotten dead. "You have given us back our names, our place in the memory of the living. This is more than we dared hope for." The phenomena that had first drawn Evelyn's attention to the situation gradually subsided after the memorial's installation, but they were replaced by something more lasting and meaningful. Visitors began coming to the memorial garden, descendants of immigrant families searching for forgotten relatives, historians researching Quebec's social history, community members who simply wanted to acknowledge the lives that had been overlooked by previous generations. The flowers that appeared regularly on individual graves suggested that the memorial had succeeded in creating connections between the living and the dead that transcended the boundaries of formal family relationships. People adopted graves, leaving offerings and remembrances for individuals they had never known, but whose stories had touched them through the biographical information provided on the memorial markers. Evelyn's work at St. Augustine Memorial Park continued, but it was transformed by her encounter with Colette and the community of forgotten dead. She began paying closer attention to burial patterns that might indicate other areas where the dead had been interred without proper memorial, working to ensure that contemporary funeral practices included provisions for people who might otherwise be buried without lasting recognition. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned that the boundary between the living and the dead was more permeable than she had previously understood, that the spirits of the deceased remained connected to the physical world through bonds of memory and recognition that could be maintained or neglected depending on the choices made by living communities. Her professional role as funeral director had expanded to include responsibilities for ensuring that those connections remained strong, that the dead were not abandoned to oblivion simply because their economic circumstances or family situations had failed to provide traditional memorial arrangements. The Memorial Garden at St. Augustine Memorial Park became a model for similar projects at other Quebec cemeteries, inspiring efforts to research and recognize forgotten burial sites throughout the province. But for Evelyn, the most meaningful result was the knowledge that her professional skills had been used to address a form of historical injustice, ensuring that people who had died without recognition finally received the acknowledgement and memorial that every human life deserved. Walking through the Memorial Garden during her regular cemetery visits, Evelyn sometimes caught glimpses of translucent figures tending spectral flowers or sitting quietly beside their newly marked graves. The sight no longer disturbed her. Instead, it provided confirmation that her work had succeeded in creating a space where the dead could exist peacefully, acknowledged and remembered by a living community that had finally learned to honor all of its members, regardless of the circumstances that had marked their deaths. The metal detector's steady rhythm had guided Andrew Colton through 3 hours of systematic searching in Laurel Hill Cemetery's historical section, where Philadelphia's founding families lay beneath monuments that rivaled European cathedrals in their architectural ambition. The spring afternoon was perfect for artifact hunting, clear skies, dry ground, and the kind of crisp air that made outdoor work pleasant rather than laborious. Andrew had obtained proper permissions from the cemetery administration, his reputation as a responsible amateur archaeologist having earned him access to search areas where others might be denied. Laurel Hill's 78 acres contained more than just graves. They held layers of Philadelphia history that extended back to the city's colonial period, when the site had served various purposes before its 1836 establishment as one of America's first rural cemeteries. Andrew's particular interest lay in Revolutionary War artifacts, items that might have been lost or discarded during the period when the area had been used for military encampments and training exercises. His collection already included buttons, buckles, and personal items that helped tell the story of ordinary soldiers who had served in the Continental Army. The cemetery's landscape reflected the ambitions of its Victorian founders, who had envisioned a burial ground that would serve as both memorial park and public education site. Elaborate monuments marked the graves of Civil War generals, industrial barons, and cultural figures whose contributions had shaped Philadelphia's development during the 19th century. But beneath these ostentatious displays lay older burials, simpler graves that marked the resting places of people who had lived through the American Revolution and its aftermath. Andrew's metal detector had been producing the usual array of modern debris: pull tabs, coins from recent decades, bits of wire and metal fragments that reflected the cemetery's use as both tourist destination and maintenance facility. But as he worked his way through a section where the monuments were older and the landscaping less formal, the detector's tone changed to indicate something more substantial buried beneath the surface. The signal was strong and consistent, suggesting a sizable metal object buried perhaps 18 inches below ground level. Andrew began digging carefully, using the archaeological techniques he had learned through years of hobby research and formal training courses. The goal was not just to recover artifacts, but to preserve their archaeological context, documenting their position and associations in ways that would maximize their historical value. The first object to emerge was a brass button, green with patina, but clearly identifiable as military in origin. The eagle design and lettering marked it as Revolutionary War period, probably from a Continental Army uniform. Andrew photographed the button in situ before removing it, documenting its exact position and orientation according to professional archaeological protocols. Further excavation revealed additional items: brass buckles that appeared to be from military equipment, a pewter spoon engraved with initials, and fragments of what might have been a leather cartridge box. But the most significant discovery came when Andrew's trowel struck something larger and more solid: a wooden chest, its iron fittings corroded but still intact, buried beneath the accumulation of 2 centuries of soil and organic matter. The chest was heavy, perhaps 2 feet long and a foot wide, constructed of hardwood with iron reinforcements that suggested both durability and value. Andrew lifted it from its burial site with the care appropriate to a museum-quality artifact, recognizing that the contents might be even more significant than the container itself. The lock mechanism had corroded beyond function, but the chest opened easily when he applied gentle pressure to the hinges. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth but had deteriorated to fragments, lay objects that made Andrew's breath catch with excitement and recognition. A military saber, its blade showing rust but its brass hilt clearly marking it as an officer's weapon from the Revolutionary War period. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellow and brittle but still legible, filled with handwriting in the precise script of 18th century education. A collection of military documents, commissions, orders, correspondence, that bore the letterheads and seals of Continental Army administration. But most intriguing were the daguerreotypes, early photographic portraits that seemed inconsistent with the Revolutionary War period, but were clearly associated with the other items in the chest. The images showed a man in military dress that spanned multiple periods of American history, as if the same individual had served in conflicts separated by decades. The faces in the photographs bore strong resemblances to each other, suggesting family relationships, but the uniforms and settings indicated service in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War. Andrew photographed everything in place before removing the items for closer examination. The journal proved to be the most revealing artifact, its entries dating from 1777 to 1863, and chronicling the experiences of someone named Captain James Morrison, who wrote about military service that seemed to extend far beyond normal human lifespan. The early entries described Revolutionary War battles in detail that suggested personal participation, while later entries covered subsequent American conflicts with the same immediacy and specificity. But it was the final entries that transformed Andrew's archaeological excitement into something approaching unease. Morrison wrote about his intention to pass on the burden to descendants who would continue his service to the nation, describing the chest's contents as sacred trust that required protection by family members who understood their inherited obligations. The last entry, dated just days before the Battle of Gettysburg, expressed hope that his son would accept the responsibilities that came with family military tradition and the supernatural protection that had kept Morrison alive through decades of warfare. As Andrew studied the artifacts in the fading afternoon light, he became aware that he was no longer alone in the cemetery. A figure approached from the direction of the older monuments, moving with the erect posture and measured pace of someone with military bearing. The man appeared to be in his 50s, dressed in a uniform that combined elements from different periods of American military history, his face showing the weathered features of someone who had spent years in outdoor service. "You found it," the figure said, his voice carrying satisfaction and relief. "I had been watching over that chest for decades, waiting for someone who would treat it with proper respect." Andrew looked up from the artifacts, realizing he was in the presence of someone who might be able to provide information about the chest's historical significance. "Are you from the cemetery administration? I have permission to search this area." The figure smiled, an expression that combined approval with something that might have been amusement. "I'm Captain James Morrison, and those are my personal effects you've discovered. I buried them here before Gettysburg, hoping they would be found by someone who could deliver them to my descendants." The implications of this statement struck Andrew with supernatural force. The man standing before him claimed to be the same James Morrison, whose journal entries spanned nearly a century of American military history, whose photographs showed service in conflicts that no single individual could have survived through natural lifespan, yet his presence felt utterly real, his knowledge of the artifacts completely authentic, his military bearing consistent with the historical periods documented in the chest's contents. "That's impossible," Andrew said, though even as he spoke he recognized that the supernatural explanation might be the only one that could account for the evidence before him. "Many things seem impossible until you understand the circumstances that make them necessary," Morrison replied. "My family has served America since the Revolution, but our service has required adjustments to normal human limitations. The artifacts you've found document that service and provide the means for continuing it." Over the next hour, as the spring afternoon faded into evening, Morrison shared a story that challenged every assumption Andrew had held about the nature of historical continuity and family obligation. The Morrison family had indeed served in every major American military conflict since the Revolution, but their service had been enabled by supernatural bargains that allowed individual family members to persist beyond normal human lifespan, in order to provide continuity of experience and commitment that transcended generational change. The chest contained more than historical artifacts. It held the documentary evidence of supernatural military service that had helped preserve American independence through periods when ordinary human efforts might have proven insufficient. The saber had been carried in battles spanning multiple conflicts, its blade blessed by powers that recognized no distinction between earthly and spiritual warfare. The journal documented not just personal experiences, but strategic knowledge that had been accumulated across decades of supernatural military service. But most importantly, Morrison explained, the artifacts served as a form of inheritance that could only be passed to family members who accepted both the privileges and responsibilities that came with supernatural military service. The photographs showed multiple generations of Morrison men who had accepted such service, their extended lifespans allowing them to provide continuity of leadership, an experience that had influenced the outcomes of American military conflicts. "My descendant lives in Philadelphia," Morrison said. "My great-great-grandson Thomas Morrison serves as a colonel in the Army Reserve, but he knows nothing of his family's true military heritage. The artifacts you've found are meant for him, along with information about the obligations he has inherited whether he understands them or not." Andrew felt the weight of historical responsibility settling on his shoulders like military equipment. His hobby archaeology had uncovered not just artifacts but evidence of supernatural military service that had implications for both historical understanding and contemporary national security. The decision he faced went beyond simple academic interest in Revolutionary War relics. It involved his role in perpetuating or interrupting a form of supernatural military service that claimed to have protected American interests for centuries. The choice, when it came, felt both inevitable and profoundly important. Andrew had devoted years to recovering and preserving historical artifacts, recognizing that such items served as tangible connections between past and present that helped contemporary people understand their place in historical continuity. The Morrison chest represented the ultimate expression of such continuity, artifacts that carried both historical significance and ongoing obligation to serve causes that transcended individual existence. "I'll find him," Andrew said. "I'll deliver the artifacts and share what you've told me." Morrison's smile held centuries of gratitude and relief. "Thank you. The burden has been heavy, watching over those items while waiting for someone who could complete the delivery. America faces challenges that require all forms of service, including forms that most people prefer not to acknowledge. The task of locating Colonel Thomas Morrison proved easier than Andrew had expected. Military records and Philadelphia city directories led him to a Germantown address, where he found a career officer whose physical resemblance to the photographs in the chest was unmistakable. Morrison received the artifacts with growing amazement as Andrew shared the story of their discovery and the supernatural encounter that had explained their significance. "My family has always had strong military traditions," Thomas said, examining the saber that bore his ancestor's name and regimental markings. "But I never understood why I felt such a strong compulsion to serve, why military service seemed less like a career choice than like fulfilling an inherited obligation." The journal entries resonated with experiences that Thomas had dismissed as unusually vivid dreams or imagination, battle scenes from conflicts he had never studied, strategic insights that seemed to arise from sources beyond his formal military education, a sense of connection to American military history that went beyond normal professional interest. Reading his ancestors' accounts, he began to understand that these experiences might represent inherited memories, supernatural knowledge that had been passed down through family bloodlines, along with the obligation to serve. The transformation in Thomas was immediate and profound. The artifacts seemed to awaken awareness that had been dormant, activating supernatural abilities that enhanced his already considerable military skills. His performance in reserve exercises improved dramatically, his strategic thinking showed insights that impressed senior officers, and his leadership qualities took on dimensions that his colleagues found both inspiring and inexplicable. But most importantly for Andrew, the successful delivery of the artifacts eliminated the supernatural phenomena that had troubled the burial site where they had been hidden. Captain James Morrison's spirit, released from his centuries-long vigil over the buried chest, was finally able to move on to whatever form of rest awaited those who had completed their earthly obligations. Andrew's subsequent visits to Laurel Hill Cemetery revealed no trace of the supernatural presence that had guided him to the buried artifacts, but he sometimes found himself returning to the site where he had made his remarkable discovery, reflecting on the role that amateur archaeology could play in preserving not just historical artifacts, but ongoing connections between past and present that required living people to serve as bridges between generations. The experience had taught him that historical artifacts were more than museum pieces or collector's items. They were tangible links in chains of obligation and service that extended across centuries, connecting the living with the dead through bonds of shared commitment to causes larger than individual existence. His role as an amateur archaeologist had been transformed into something approaching sacred calling, ensuring that important historical legacies were not lost to the passage of time or the failure of living communities to understand their inherited responsibilities. Walking through the cemetery's older sections, Andrew sometimes heard the faint sound of military marching in the distance, as if ghostly formations continued their eternal drill on grounds that had witnessed their service across multiple periods of American history. The sounds no longer disturbed him. Instead, they served as reminders that the boundary between past and present was more permeable than most people realized, that the sacrifices of previous generations continued to influence contemporary events through channels that required living people to serve as guardians and interpreters of supernatural legacies. The metal detector that had led him to the Morrison chest continued to guide his searches through Philadelphia's historical sites. But now Andrew understood that his archaeological work served purposes beyond academic curiosity or personal collecting. He was helping to maintain connections between past and present that were essential to the continuity of American military tradition, ensuring that supernatural forms of service could continue to protect national interests through challenges that might require more than ordinary human responses.